I'm sure all of you know this, that I'm Pastor Karen Moritz, the pastor here at First Christian, and it is such a joy to welcome you. I have my shirt on, as do many of our members. If you have any questions or if there's anything that you need, don't hesitate to ask. And if it's within reason, we'll get it for you. Hopefully, you've been in our building before, but just to kind of orient you a little bit, if you go back outside the sanctuary out here to my right, behind me here, there is a unisex restroom there right beside our chapel, should you need that. I would urge you to lock the door unless you like company. If you don't, there's also, if you go down that long hallway past the parlor where you came in and had refreshments this morning, there's a men and women's restroom in there as well. If for some reason it gets so crowded and full, there are small restrooms on the second floor. If you feel like you need to get your steps in and you want to climb up to the second floor, they're up there. But otherwise, everything you need should be here on the first floor. And I think they're leaving refreshments there in the parlor. Should you need a little pick-me-up partway through the day, do help yourself. We will be having lunch in the gym, and that is kind of back behind where you were here in the parlor. It's kind of a big building. If you have to drop breadcrumbs, I get it, but otherwise you can just ask one of us and we would be happy to get you where you need to go or help you get what you need. So I think Teresa is here. Teresa? Ah, here she comes. And Teresa's going to do our, oh, you can do here. Just watch the steps. Good to have you here. Welcome.
Might need another step. Good morning. I didn't realize how much I had missed all your faces in person. It is so great to finally be able to start seeing each other again. We originally were trying to decide, we started planning this back in 2018, 2019. And we started in the fall, thought we were going to do it in the spring and realized we couldn't pull it together that quick with what we wanted for the first year. And then we had a couple other barriers, a couple of years, and I think most of you have lived through those also. So finally, we're back together today and just welcome everybody here. A couple of quick announcements. Instead of Carol Devine being the speaker, she has lost her voice, and it's going to be Scott Harden-Near, the Associate Minister of Green Chalice, will be doing the presentation. For those that are joining virtually, I needed to tell you we will be going to lunch from like 11:45 to 12:30. So we will be off of the virtual presentation during that time. When we go into lunch in the gym, there is a resource table that is set up, and it has information from the Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light, Lincoln Electric Systems, Arbor Day Foundation, Green Chalice, and then Blessed Tomorrow. Paul, did I miss anything you asked me to announce? Okay, then we will go ahead and get started. We gather today to rejoice in the creation of the world. God, in his infinite compassion, has lovingly formed our planet and all that live within it. He declared his creation good and entrusted us to care for it along with each other. Sometimes in our everyday lives, we forget our responsibility to care for nature. Today, as we reflect on the marvels and wonders of creation, let us renew our commitment as good stewards to the earth. May we use the world's resources we need with love, humility, and thoughtfulness, without guilt, without fear, without waste. May we live together with animals with which we share this planet, being careful not to harm them or their habitats. May we respect the life in our lakes, rivers, and oceans, using them with care and being mindful in our efforts not to pollute them. May we learn to live within our means by reducing our waste and continuing to reuse and recycle all that we can. May we plan to leave the world in a state that all future generations will be able to enjoy, ensuring that it is filled with resources, life, and kept healthy and clean. And now for my prayer. Lord, creator of all living things, help guide our daily actions and thoughts to become better stewards of the earth. Guide us to act responsibly, care for the earth you gave us, and make wise choices in our everyday living. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Is it time for Scott? I think I'll go ahead and go now. Thank you very much for that prayer and that welcome, and for this gathering that you guys have come together to explore creation care and how to be faithful followers of Christ in the midst of a crisis, multiple crises, actually. As you heard, I'm Scott Hardin-Neary. I'm a co-director and pastor with Carol Devine with Green Chalice of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And we're grateful to serve alongside you all as we listen how we might best accompany God in this work in creation care. As you heard, Carol sends her regrets. She was excited about this, and we have been thinking with you all about this for a couple of years now, and she was all prepared and just was not able to make it happen. So she sends regrets, and obviously we would love to be there in the sanctuary with you in person. But we've learned a lot about how we can remain connected and actually grow together via Zoom. So I'm really excited that I can be with you. I'm in Myrtle Beach, actually. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and my son has a soccer tournament in Myrtle Beach. And so I'm in a hotel room near the beach while he's playing soccer. So that's kind of where I am. I'm going to share my screen and then begin our time together, or continue our time together. As you can see, Carol and I have been working together for the last 6 or 7 years to serve with Green Chalice. We're grateful to be a part of this. And Carol began Green Chalice almost a decade ago in Kentucky, and is able to has served well in this role as both a congregational pastor and a Green Chalice pastor, now as the director of Blessed Tomorrow. I don't know how this is going to work, but we're going to try this anyway. I can't see any of you, but I assume that you are in the room there, the sanctuary at First Christian. And I'm going to invite you to listen with me to your own lives for a moment. And if you're sitting near one another, that's great. If you are online, I invite you to take a few deep breaths. Getting grounded, and invite you now to perhaps close your eyes and try to recall a time when you experienced God in nature. Some people might call it an awe moment, or a moment of wonder, or for some of us, terror, but a time when you experienced grace in the midst of nature. As you're trying to hone down that one moment, I invite you to try to recall the colors or the images that come for you from that experience. Remember, if you're able, the sounds when you were in this moment of awe or God moment in nature. What did you hear? Remember, if you're able, the scent of that experience. What did you smell? Can you remember any of the scents around you? As you remember this time, I invite you to recall the sensations, perhaps a wind or cool breeze or hot temperatures, sand beneath your feet. What did you feel during this God moment? As you're recalling this moment with God, I invite you to recall your reactions in this time. What were your thoughts? What were your feelings? In your own way, I invite you to silently offer gratitude to God for this moment and this time of memory. And when you are ready, I invite you to open your eyes and return your attention to the sanctuary of First Christian. Now, this is where it'll get a little tricky because I cannot see you and get a sense of what's happening there. So you guys may have all disappeared and gone somewhere else. But if you're there, great, I can see you now. Thank you. I wonder if it's possible for you to turn to a neighbor or two and just share a main character from your God moment. It could be the stars or a chipmunk or the ocean, a main character, and one thing you noticed about that experience. Like for me, it might be stars, and I experienced awe or wonder. And so I invite you to turn to your neighbor. And if you don't know their names, I invite you to share your name and then the main character and a reaction that you had. And then we'll just take about 3 to 5 minutes for you to share with your neighbors. And I'm going to trust that you guys are going to find each other. And if you're introverted extremely and you don't want to do this, it's totally fine too. I'm here in this room by myself, and so I don't have to share with anyone. So my introverted side will get fed right this minute. Otherwise, I invite you to take a risk and connect with each other as you're able, and I will call us back in about 3 to 5 minutes. On your mark, get set, go. take about another 30 seconds or minute. Please make sure everyone has an opportunity to share their experience or their story. Okay, I invite you to turn your attention back to the center of the room when you're able. Finishing up there. Thank you for experimenting and participating in that. We're going to try something even wilder than that, but I invite you to, as you're able or interested, to share a word that describes how you felt or what your experience was when you were remembering that story or sharing that story. So what was it like for you to share or tell that story? And maybe if you can say it out loud, I'll maybe be able to hear you. If not, the rest of the group will be able to hear you. And then I'll have a second question, but just share a word or a couple of words of reaction.
Here, so I'm hearing words joy,
Joy.
wonder, energizing, inspiring, gratitude, peaceful, holiness. How about our people online? Do you have any words? They're speechless.
Thank you. And so then a second question is, what was it like to hear the story from others? So as a listener, you got to hear somebody else's God moment or experience of awe. In a word or two, what was it like for you to hear their story?
Awing, oneness, inspiring. Say it again. Fun, exciting, interesting, relatable, energizing, newness. Celebrating a bond.
Thank you. Wow, and thank you for repeating those words. That's so powerful for me to hear a glimpse. And maybe during lunch or throughout this weekend, you all can share a little more in depth about these experiences, these moments. We have heard that nature is where we first encounter God, that our first Bible, the first creativity of God, came in this midst of creation. And so you just offered the first reading of the Holy Scripture this morning as you shared your story of awe or gratitude in nature. We also have many other scriptures that point us towards compassion and connection to God through and around nature. Obviously, I can barely read all these texts, and I don't know how large the screen is there at First Christian, but my hunch is there's a lot of words there. These are not meant for you to read through all of them, but just an indicator of some of the breadth of what is happening in the Hebrew scriptures, the ways that the audiences and variety of books of the Hebrew scriptures were invited to interact with, to listen to, and to recognize God's presence in the midst of nature. Starting with Genesis, God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was good. Including the New Testament as well. And you all have been doing this work, and so the scriptural basis for how we are engaging in creation care is not new to you, but just another series of passages there in the New Testament passages, scriptures. One that stands out for me in particular is Mark 12, 28 through 31. And this has informed much of my theology in general. And I hear this echoed in discipledom. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. Seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." My family and I had an opportunity to expand our understanding of neighbors and neighborhood. We were invited to live in Monteverde, Costa Rica, and serve with the global ministries of our Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the United Church of Christ. And we were there, our understanding of neighborhood grew exponentially, not just because of our Costa Rican neighbors that were humans, but also because of the ways that we interacted with creation and the newness of what our little minds could handle around what was happening near our home and in the forest nearby. This is one of the early neighbors that welcomed us with the loud knock on the window. That's my hand. And so I don't know if you can get a sense of size there, but this grasshopper with a little scarf around his neck was one of the early greeters. And different insects and creatures were reminding us of the diversity of God's creativity there. I'm just going to tell you a few little stories about my neighbors. So this is what's happening right now. I don't know if you had banked on this with Carol, but this is I just wanted you to meet some of my neighbors. This is a millipede, and this lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains as well as in Costa Rica. You may have them there in Nebraska, I'm not sure. But this guy has three little defense mechanisms to protect it from being eaten. One is, you can imagine, it rolls up like a roly-poly to protect itself with its scales, its armor. The second is to poop, to make itself taste really badly in that way. And you probably didn't imagine you were going to be hearing about poop in church this morning, but that's its second defense. Its third line of defense, if it's irritated enough, is that it emits a tiny amount of cyanide gas from between its scales. And so if you have it in your hand and it's irritated, and you move it away from the poop hand into the other hand, you'll be able to smell like a cherry scent or an almond scent of it as it emits this gas to protect itself. So just an amazing creature in nature that we were around. This human is my daughter, Olivia. She's now 18, about to graduate from high school, or has graduated from high school. She's holding a Hercules Beetle, which is one of the largest insects in the world. And when it flies, it sounds like a helicopter. An amazing creature that was a neighbor of ours there in Monteverde. These sloths were right outside of our door of our home in the forest right across the street there. A mama hanging upside down with a baby. The amazing gift of what we experienced when we were there is this understanding of the interconnectedness of nature, and which really helped me understand the interconnectedness of all things, that our social justice work, our love for neighbor work is really tied to how we deal with creation, how we look at pollution, how we deal with climate change. These things are all intersected, especially as we think of as people of faith. But this particular sloth, the scientists that we were around in Monteverde told us that up to 100 different kinds of plants and animals can live on a sloth's body at a time, different kinds of species. For instance, one is a kind of mold that grows to create a greenness on the back of the sloth. And there's a particular kind of moth that eats only that kind of mold or moss to help reduce the amount of moss that's growing on the sloth, that allows it to be more camouflaged in the forest there. So just amazing interconnectedness and intersectionality. It's a little loud, high pitched. That's a 3-wattled bellbird, and that's one of the loudest calls in all of nature. Up to 2 kilometers, you can hear that sound. This is a juvenile or a teenager. Adult male is got a white chest, and you can see his little kind of mustache on the side of his beak there. So they call it the 3-wattled bellbird. And he's got 2 on one side and 1 on the other. And that loud call is one way for him to attract mates. It's kind of a dating ritual, but it's also a way to repel other males from your tree. And so he's standing on the edge of this branch, and the adult male, the older male, would come and land on the inside of that branch and try to repel the younger one out from his tree. And the one way that he does that is just to shimmy over, using his body to kind of push him off. And if that doesn't work, then he'll turn his head and bonk into the ear of the teenager in that way. And so there's this kind of like ritual that's a defense mechanism as well as an attraction. And I can relate a little bit with the teenager getting yelled at sometimes. Try to reduce that amount of times that happens, but I've got 2 teenagers in the house, and so the desire to sometimes turn my head and bonk loudly at them is real. This is a blue-crowned motmot, an incredible little bird that sounds like this. Woot, 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 woot. So we would hear in the forest as we would walk through that little dripping water sound, and reminded us of the motmot nearby. These not the motmot, but the bellbird, and then the resplendent quetzal, which you may have heard of before. They eat these particular kinds of avocados. So there are 33 kinds of avocado species in the Monteverde area. This is not good for guacamole, but it is good for birds. And one of the ways that I learned about this was I was walking in the forest with a guide, and I heard something drop out of the forest. And the guide said, "Would you go grab that thing that fell?" I went and grabbed it. It was like a little acorn. I picked it up, and he said, "What does it feel like?" And I said, it's really warm." And he said, "Well, it's an avocado seed that was just regurgitated by a bellbird." And I was like, "Oh, I'm holding bird regurgitation. Thank you for telling me that before it happened." But what I learned is that the birds, those kind of birds, will disperse seeds, and there are a variety of ways that happens, now in North America as well as Central America. But without the birds moving these avocado seeds around the forest would not be as healthy or vibrant as it is. So this interconnectedness is really powerful for how I've experienced nature there. So the challenge that I heard when I was in Monteverde over and over again from the people, and then experienced it through the science there, is that our neighbors were continually under threat. that they were experiencing a difference in their rain and a difference in how their environment was. So the cloud forests of Monteverde, many of the trees and plants absorb water directly out of the sky in these clouds. And so hundreds of species, if not thousands, receive their water from this particular kind of weather that's there in the cloud forest. And what we kept hearing is that those patterns were changing. So the rains were falling more brutally, less mist and more hard rain. And that they were falling in shorter amounts of time. So just a few days versus over the course of months. And so people were describing their drought experiences where their rain wasn't coming like they needed it for their wells. Different kinds of plants were beginning to dry out in the forest. Frog species had disappeared. There were different kinds of things that were happening, including species coming up the mountain that had not been found there prior, that they were known of. So we heard from cab drivers and hotel owners and Quakers and scientists and Catholics that climate change was real and it was impacting them. And this was not a Republican or a Democratic issue in Costa Rica. This was a life or death issue. And so I began to look at climate change and creation care in a new way when I was there in Monteverde. And so part of what I began to recognize when I was there and what I'm experiencing with congregations is that we have this dual role of trying to listen deeply to discernment, to prayer, to God's movement in the Spirit now, to be patient and Sabbath seeking. And there's an urgency around particularly climate change. That the time we're 30 to 50 years beyond the time when we should have acted. And so there's this timing that needs to happen quickly. And so we're trying to do this dance between wisdom and urgency, connecting the urgency of compassionate, intentional action on climate change and creation care with your congregations and your own families, particular gifts, passions, resources, relationships, and skills. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. I wanted to share with you a therapist named Judith Glickson, and she's out of Boston right now, but she was also in Asheville for a while playing with the symphony there. And she was a therapist, but then also played the cello. And she began to understand more and more about the climate crisis and became distraught. And then she described herself as a type A personality. And in the midst of that type A-ness is also practicing Jew. And she stepped away from her busyness and her work for several days to spend some time in Sabbath and prayer. During that time, she had an epiphany that she would like to offer cello concerts that would raise funds for local climate organizations and creation care organizations. So she created this concert series, which we hosted 5 concerts in the Asheville area, called One Cello, One Planet. She would offer slides to go with each Bach piece that she played that culminated into a piece of music that is coinciding cello notes with the points of a graph from the last 100 years of temperature change in the United States. And so it's a cello song that indicates the data from this chart. So she was able to connect not just her own Sabbath and spiritual life to this climate action, but what she had access to in the moment. So it wasn't like, I'm going to get a sustainability degree, or I'm going to go get a political science degree, or I'm going to go to seminary. She knew how to play the cello. She had this passion, and she had resources and relationships to be able to take the Sabbath to move it towards action. And so that's part of our invitation as church, is to listen to the world's greatest needs, right? And to meet that with our own passions and our skills. Some things, so this is just a little primer about climate, and you all may know all this, so I'm gonna go through it fairly quickly, but just a little understanding around how the climate is changing. We recognize that there are a lot of different viewpoints about climate change and about some of the causes and some of the impacts of climate change. We are not the definitive, but this is the latest science that we understand and some of the work that we've been working with. We recognize that that the surface temperatures as well as water surface temperatures and depths are growing. And as those temperatures increase, the possibilities of more droughts and intensity of storms will happen. As water vapor is evaporated into the atmosphere, it becomes fuel for more powerful storms to develop. And that's just one impact of a changing climate. As people of faith, we care about some of these justice issues, and not every congregation or individual cares about all of these, but generally, people of faith care about having healthy water. They care about welcoming the stranger and offering food to those who have less food. We want peace. We want to love our neighbor fully and care for future generations. We care about women and men and people of all genders and identities. We do want there to be fairness and justice around the economy. All of these issues and many more that your congregations are already working on will be exponentially more challenging in a time that climate is disrupted and is changing. So just a little bit about the climate science, some more. This is like the greenhouse effect is kind of the basic problem, is that solar radiations passes through the clear atmosphere, kind of like your car windows on a cool day. It's warmer inside your car than outside, so the solar radiation passes through the atmosphere. A lot of it's absorbed by the Earth's surface and begins to warm it. And then some of the radiation is reflected back by the Earth and escapes out of the atmosphere. Some of the greenhouse gases have created a thicker or an atmosphere or blanket, if you will, that's thicker, and it's not letting as much of that solar radiation out of the atmosphere. And so it's heating up the surface of the Earth. Gosh, I keep pushing the wrong clicks. My screen sharing is paused. No. You still see it now? Okay, great. So there are 26,000, give or take, independent lines of evidence that suggest that our planet is warming. Just some of these are that the glaciers, I was just in a place where there were a lot of great glaciers in the Andes Mountains in Peru, and I heard from local people there that glaciers were all around where we were hiking just 10 years ago, and now there were just a few glaciers left. The temperature over land, snow cover, permafrost was retreating. Did you know that trees migrate? They are migrating towards the poles, like so heading north and south, and they also are heading upward along lines of altitude. The same things are happening for a variety of species besides trees. All species are migrating poleward and upward. Spring, you may have noticed, is coming earlier. The things that are blooming in your yard probably are happening a little sooner than they did 10 years ago, maybe even a couple of years ago. We know that the ocean heat content, the sea level is higher, there's less sea ice, and there's the sea levels are rising. This is a video just as a sense of the temperature variation across averages, just to get a sense of how the temperatures changed over the past 100 years or so. One way that I've heard it put is that my children, I have an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old. This year is likely to be, it was another record-breaking year regarding heat. And so it was probably one of the hottest years that I've ever lived on Earth. And it will probably be one of the coolest years that my children will ever live on Earth. So the idea of what we are handing our children, our grandchildren, is troubling to me as people of faith. In 2021, we had many $1 billion. That means that the impact was over $1 billion. This was another kind of record breaking. There were 20 of them, $1 billion weather events that impacted the US only in 2021. Nebraska had one of those in July of this year, in 2021, with the storms that came through there, and you can see a variety of other ones. So this is a financial dynamic as well. It's harder for us to care for one another when we're responding to these, and the same is true for Week of Compassion of our denomination, for our disciples volunteering. Probably even your region has responded to some of these disasters, and when we're pouring money into that kind of response, it's difficult to do other kinds of ministries when this need is so great. Now, Nebraska averages about 15 days a year with dangerous temperatures, and the estimates by NOAA, this is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, predict that it'll be about 40 days like that, and that's just in about 30 years. And that there'll be more widespread drought in the western part of our country. There is a general consensus on climate change. Maybe some of you have seen the movie Don't Look Up. That has an interesting parallel to what we're seeing around climate. But the National Academy of Sciences, 100% of them suggest that climate change is real, it's measurable, and it's human induced. 13,950 peer-reviewed scientific articles say that climate change is happening and that we are the main cause, and there are solutions to support a different future. Some of the drivers of our changing climate, like we said before, is greenhouse gases, transportation. This is US are the numbers on top, and then globally the numbers below. Transportation and the way that we burn fossil fuels for that participates 29%. Electrical production is 28%. Industry in general, this includes like making concrete and other kinds of industry, is 22%. And then agriculture, and I can't see the last one because my screen, but you can see the numbers there. These are different ways that we are producing greenhouse gases. We are experiencing it now. Like I said, some of those indicators are things that you can see in your backyard. Your congregation's facing some of the things that are measurable and real. The role of humans is clear in a lot of ways. The atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide have increased to levels unprecedented. In the last 800,000 years, they use ice core samples and different kinds of samples to measure these molecules from 800,000 years ago. There are increased magnitudes of warming, and those increase the likelihood of pervasive and irreversible impacts. So they compound on one another, and the overall risks of climate change impacts are troubling. We have the opportunity to step into this problem with our whole bodies, our whole lives, and with our whole faith. People of faith have been on the front lines responding to the symptoms of climate change and creation care challenges for many years, and we have an opportunity, and many in your region are already doing the good work to try to listen to how God is moving around this issue. Let's see if I can figure out where I used to think that the top environmental problems of biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. That's Gus Beth. Scientists don't know how to do cultural and spiritual transformation, he says, but who does know how to do spiritual and cultural transformation? The church. That's our role. That's our call in the world. As people of faith, as communities of faith, we have access to a power and to a beauty that some other organizations and some other individuals may or may not have access to. At our best, faith communities can think generationally. We care about our kids. We care about our grandkids. We want to pass on not just our faith, we want to pass on a world that is vibrant and that will allow them to thrive in a good way. So we think generationally, we're not just thinking about the next election cycle or the next quarter of earnings or the next semester. We're thinking about the next 2 or 3 generations out, and we also honor the generations of our past. We as faith communities at our best hold stories of resilience and hope. We know how to do relationships, even though you have probably been in a church that has been in a fight over styrofoam cups or the color of the carpet, and probably have even seen churches split in your region over things similar to this. Even though you probably have been with people in your region and your congregation for a long time, you know how to do relationships well. In a time when we are so fragmented as a country and as a community, you all know how to at least try to be curious about one another and how to love one another through disagreements. Faith communities at our best also contain an element of holy creativity, prophetic imaginations, not only through our stories in scripture, but also through your stories of your faith community, hearing the stories even of how God had entered into a relationship with you through nature this morning. You have an element of holy creativity. And so the science, even though it's powerful and it's an expression of God's wisdom through human hands and brains, and we know that that's not just the last word, that we have access to a sense of something that's bigger than what can be seen. But Green Chalice, as you heard, Carol Devine helped to instigate and create Green Chalice. Now we have 17 Green Chalice certified congregations, which are, they've done all the extra gold stars. It takes a couple of years to be certified. We have 17 in the US and Canada, 27 regions are represented, almost 200 Green Chalice congregations in our denomination. Christ Mount, a camp near Asheville, North Carolina, and Black Mountain is a Green Chalice partner camp, and there are others that are Green Chalice. Lexington Theological Seminary is a Green Chalice seminary. It's the first seminary that's a Green Chalice seminary. And now we have Blue Theology mission statements. So some of you may have heard of this, but Pacific Road Christian Church out in California is a Blue Theology mission station, and they have a full summer of congregations that are attending camps there where they're learning about creation care and climate and the oceans. And they're seeding other mission stations on the Atlantic coast and also in the Gulf of Mexico. And so I'm excited about how they're continuing the Green Chalice movement. We have 2 congregations, one in Kentucky and one in California, and one that's on the way in Texas, that are going carbon neutral, which means that they're trying to do their best to reduce their carbon output, and then use carbon offsets to mitigate anything beyond that. As a Green Chalice congregation, just raise your hand if you are a part of a Green Chalice congregation, just so I can see if anyone is. If not, that's fine, totally fine. But the 3 kind of steps to becoming a Green Chalice congregation is to create a little green team, so you're not alone doing this good work. Sign this covenant, worship, study, repent, advocate, and rest. And then the third thing is just to do 3 things in your congregation to act on creation care. That's to become a Greenhouse church. All right, let's see. We have 10 minutes. Let's go ahead and watch this video from Midway Christian Church in Kentucky, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
This image of welcome greets all who come to our church. This is a symbol to the world that we stand for acceptance. We stand for compassion. We care for each other, and we care for our community. As followers of Christ, we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. And if we love our neighbors, we love God's creation as well. Here at Midway Christian Church, creation care is a part of how we live our faith. Protecting God's creation means protecting our brothers and sisters everywhere. It extends beyond our church and beyond even our community. Some of us are more worried than others about how we are treating our natural world, about our changing climate. But we all know that we should walk more gently together on God's earth. We all deserve clean air, clean water, and a thriving world around us. But things are changing. Some of our churches are facing wildfires or floods or drought in places where they've never had them before. And it's the most vulnerable among us, the children, elderly, and poor, who suffer the most from these changes. So what do we do about it? For us, it started as a way to save money. We were spending too much to heat and cool our church. And there were so many ways to save money by saving energy. More efficient heating and ventilation, LED lights in the fellowship hall, insulating windows and timed outdoor lighting. Every one of these changes helped keep our air and water clean and keep pollution out of the atmosphere. But caring for creation is much more than just saving energy. It's about making choices that reduce our impact and help us all live healthier lives. It's about making better use of the resources God gave us. We care for God's creation through all of these things, but most important of all, through people. At God's table, we partake in the central meal that sustains us and connects us to each other and to all of God's creation. Here, God's love is expansive and the welcome is wide. It's by coming together that we can do extraordinary, positive things for our children, our congregation, and our community, and create a healthier, safer climate and a more equitable world for ourselves and future generations. At Midway Christian Church, we're living out a legacy of love. Won't you join us at the table?
So they began with saving money, and you all may have your own ways that you might want to engage in this kind of work if you choose to engage in this kind of work. Listening to your own congregation, what you might hope to bring about. So there are a few different No. You can see the creation care spaces where you might engage in this kind of work. So it's not just solar panels or recycling. It could be including prayers and music in your worship services. It could be including educational moments for your children, for your youth, a book study, or a video review or a movie night where you're exploring different kinds of creation care. It does, of course, include, if your congregation owns or cares for land or buildings, reducing your energy use, looking at how you might save money around energy efficiency. It might be planting more trees on your land or using your land for growing vegetables or fruits for your neighbors. That these ways of saving money around weatherization and maybe solar could be rolled into a green fund within your congregation or for your region to support the kind of ecological things happening. Also talking about it, bearing witness to both policymakers as well as friends and neighbors to let congregations around you know about your commitment to creation care and climate action. And then also building relationships to both mitigate, which means to try to stop climate change, and also adapt, which means to adapt to any changes that are happening. And you can partner with nonprofits, with businesses, breweries, and schools, whatever that is. You as disciples have a real leg up on what it means to work together with people outside and within your congregation. I want to say also that Carol has seen this, and I've seen it as well, that congregations that are doing this kind of work, whether it's, no matter what the level is or the kind of Green Chalice, it's attractive to new people. And so we're seeing that a lot of our congregations that are engaged in creation care work are really vital congregations, that they, even if they're small congregations, they're receiving new energy and they're receiving new members fairly regularly, partially because of their work around creation care. So I want to think of that as the evangelical step. All right, we just got a few minutes, so I'm just going to move through some of these. There are resources on the greenchalice.org website to help you begin to prioritize. I would say that it's really important for you to listen to your own context. There was a Presbyterian woman who was a part of a wild goose workshop that I was offering, and she described during her check-in time her congregation. She said, I've been working with this church around creation care for about a year, and we're just trying to get recycling for the fellowship hour. This is pre-pandemic, and so they were eating and drinking together after church. And she had a recycling basket and a trash basket, and she had a sign that had all the different pictures of the things you could put in the recycling, and a sign that had all the pictures of the things you can put in the trash. She put stuff in the bulletin, she put it in the newsletter. The pastor offered it from the pulpit, like when and how to recycle. And yet every Sunday after the fellowship hour, she was shifting things out of the recycling and putting it into the trash, and taking things out of the trash and putting recycling. And she was furious when she was describing this to me. And she just said she may leave the church because they don't care about God's creation. She was so upset with her community. And together in that small group of people, we began to listen with her to suggest that maybe that community didn't really want to recycle. Maybe that was for her home and for her personal, but maybe that community really cared about something else, like children. Maybe they wanted to do a vacation Bible school, and they had energy and passion. Maybe the Spirit of God was moving around their children's ministry, or maybe it was around weatherization, that they had a few people that were retired engineers or contractors that really had a passion around weatherization. Maybe that was where God's Spirit was moving. So we began to listen for how each congregation, each individual might step into this work, because there are so many solutions and opportunities to act. It's not just one way. And so your congregation, and this weekend, you'll have an opportunity to listen together about your individual churches, where they are, what kind of money or buildings or land they might have or don't have, and what kind of people you have access to begin to listen to how God might move you forward. All right, I can't see my little. All right, so carbon neutral, that's one of our goals. Our disciples voted on during a general assembly to try as a denomination to become carbon neutral in 8 years. It is very daunting, but we are grateful to have the goal. Like I said before, Blessed Tomorrow, as well as Green Chalice, has a moving forward guide that can help congregations and individuals begin to move towards being carbon neutral. And that's important for congregations as well as homes. Just like I said before, starting with where you are, where is your passion? Where are the people excited, and where is God stirring in your congregation? Just start there. You don't have to start with recycling or solar or marching or anything like that. Just start with what's really feeding your soul. We're invited to talk about climate. Many people, especially in the disciples, we found through different surveys that people are worried about climate change. We're just not hearing about climate change from one another. So even if we don't know exactly what the cause is or what the solutions are, talking about climate change is important. These are just suggestions to commit to carbon neutrality, get a creation care team or green chalice team. I'm going to keep us moving because I know we're out of time. Baseline energy audit is a good first step, and you can do that just by looking up online, just finding a simple energy audit. Even in your youth group or others can walk around your church and kind of look for areas you might be able to save money. That's an easy one, and sometimes your energy company will help you with that. Develop a plan to reduce and that savings that you have, you might roll it forward into other kinds of environmental friendly projects. Renewable energy. Nebraska is now the only Republican controlled state in the US that's moving towards fully decarbonize its energy sector by the mid-century. Powerful work that your state is doing. We found that in the midst of conversations around energy efficiency and mitigation and trying to slow climate change, that we are seeing a lot of mental health implications. And so when you saw that slide about the $1 billion impacts in the US, you can imagine that every one of those $1 billion impacts has a psychological element to it, a pastoral care element to it. And you probably saw that in your state after the impacts of the July storms. So there's the symptoms of climate change that the church can respond to, the impacts of that, but there's also continually an existential dynamic to climate change, that particularly our younger people, but also I've sat with several people in the older generations that are feeling guilt or sadness about how our children will have a different future than they had. And so there's remorse. For our younger people, there's anger and frustration, but there's a variety of ways that the church can step into pastoral care around ecological grief, and not just ecological grief around climate change, but also the pandemic is connected to ecology and many other things. So I'm grateful that you all continue to serve your communities, and wonder if that might be an area of work to be done, that the church is uniquely positioned to do pastoral care in the midst of this. All right, this is carbon offsets. This is when you purchase ways to try to help offset the carbon that you're emitting, paying it forward. Advocating for encouraging local, state, and national leaders with compassionate nudging to care for creation. And then I'll end this here. So I wonder if there are questions. And I think I'm a little bit over, apologize for going over time there and rushing through the end, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If there's something you need me to go back to, I will. That was a lot. I will also say that this is overwhelming work. So I'm hoping that you will have time to rest and breathe and care for one another. And you are not alone. There are many of us that are doing this work, but it also is, it's hard. It's very hard. So thank you.
And I think we want to thank you, Scott, for your presentation today. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it, but maybe if we do a little applause. Very grateful to you for your presentation and for your thoughtfulness. Costa Rica, yes, is a beautiful country. I got to visit it once as well. It's wonderful. So thank you for sharing that. We are going to take a 10-minute break, is my understanding, especially for those of you who are online with us. We'll be breaking from 10:35 to 10:45. There are resources, I think, as was mentioned earlier, and I believe some from the Green Chalice in the gym where we'll be having lunch. So there's lots of information, and thank you, Scott, for sharing the resources and information as well. Is there any closing comments or remarks? Great. Thank you, Scott, very, very much. And we'll take a 10-minute break for everybody. So thank you.
Thanks. Feel free to email us or call us if you have any questions.
Great.
Bye.
scientific findings of the past half century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Got to remember where I'm supposed to stand so the microphone picks up. One of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is our church. I'm very proud to be the properties chair of this church. And one of the things that I'm noticing is as we watch what's going on, some of that was done many years ago in this facility. The way we air condition is really unique. We don't have a refrigerated air system. What we do is we make ice, and that ice is stored in a tank in the basement that's about 10 foot by 10 foot, about 4 foot deep. And in a 24-hour period, that will fill with ice, and it takes a small amount of electricity to generate that ice, instead of turning on a big unit that takes a lot of electricity. And then this unit, when we decide it's time to turn the air conditioning on, will cool this sanctuary in about half an hour. And what it does, it pumps cold water through a coil, and you can feel the air handler now because it's on, just circulating air. We haven't yet established that system for this year. But the thing about it is, it uses a little bit of electricity over a longer period of time, instead of the way other churches usually are air conditioned, with a system very similar to what's in a house. And it turns on and it draws a tremendous amount of electricity. The utilities here in Lincoln, LES, they have what is called a demand charge. And the demand charge is for the amount of electricity you use maximum. And then it charges against that. The thing about that is, that's at a much higher rate. One of the things, as you look at this sanctuary, the lighting in here was put in when this was done. And there are 22 lights on the ceiling. This is one of our issues. This is our energy hog in this facility. The light bulbs that are up there are halogens. They look just like this. That's a 500-watt bulb. Considering this is a 60-watt bulb like you'd have in your house, these each are 500 watts. They generate their light by a process that is incandescence, which is using heat to make using electricity to make heat that makes the filament glow. Each one of these, if you put two together, that's equivalent to a 1,000-watt electric heater. There's like 11 of them up there. The problem is, we, technology-wise, cannot replace those with an LED at this point. We don't want to change the fixtures. So that's an issue. Along this wall are spotlights. This is the bulb that's in those spotlights. It's a 500-watt bulb, and they're the same kind that are used in studios. The thing about them is they're very long life. We've replaced 3 of them since the sanctuary was done. They last a very long time. The real problem is, to replace one of those bulbs, you used to use a stick and you could go up and change the bulb. The fixtures are made for that. But the problem is, the bulbs nowadays are made of this is quartz glass, and it's very fragile. We cannot change the bulbs with a stick anymore because the glass has gotten so thin they break. So we got to wait for a scaffolding, and then they set up a scaffolding. Well, with all the construction going on, we've got one over here that's been burned out for quite a while, and we can't get it replaced because 2 months it's been that way. So here's an issue that we have. You know, when we started working on this program more than 2 years ago, I thought it'd be easy to be a green chalice. I read all the material, man, we got it. We're still working on it. It's not a difficult process, but when we had all of the pandemic and all this stuff going on, I have a group of individuals divided into 2 groups. One is, they're all part of the team that I work with, and that's the properties team. Part of those people are responsible for doing the unlocking of the church and the locking of the church every service. And the other group takes care of mowing the lawn. That group together will become the committee that we're going to use for Green Chalice. And I promise you, within a year, we're going to have this program finished. But at this point, we still are not a Green Chalice church. And I apologize for that because I thought it'd be a lot easier. but then they invented the pandemic and that kind of changed things a little bit. Let's talk about lighting. Plain old 60-watt light bulb. There's a lot of disadvantages. First of all, that's so hot now, I wouldn't want to touch it. Secondly, it's very inefficient. That 60-watt light bulb generates 800 lumens of light. A lumen of light is a measurement of how bright it is, but that's all it measures. This bulb beside it is what they decided was the standard we'll use in all homes. This bulb is about the same color as that bulb. That's in Kelvin, which is the measurement of, it's the color by heat. That is 2600 degree Kelvin is the color temperature of that bulb. And 60 watt was standard, so now when you go in a store to buy light bulbs, 60 watt, this is 2600, they call it warm white. That's the color designation. Well, technology has marched on, and we can go with, this is 3000 Kelvin, is this light. And for some of us older people that kind of still have some issues, we've come up with this one. And this one is 5000 Kelvin, and we call it daylight. That's equivalent to what daylight is. All of these bulbs are of the same intensity. All of them are 8,000 lumens, but the difference in color temperature. Now, when we start talking about color temperature, what looks good in one place doesn't look good in another place. As you walk through this church, and we've got, do we have? This is the entrance to the chapel. And if you notice, there's a fixture hanging there. That fixture has LED bulbs in it. And when we get through with this, I would like you to walk around the church and look at these and try to use that. How would that look in my church or in my home? That's there, and that's what the fixture looks like. And if you don't know that it's not the old style bulbs, you would think, hey, that's really good. Uh-oh, he just took control away from me. There, I got control back. Now you can see how that is going into the chapel. There's the fixture that's going into the chapel. All of the hall lights are LEDs. We've done that with the hall lights. In the chapel, the side lights, because we didn't want to throw away good bulbs, they are still the old style bulbs, but all the ones in the center line are all LED bulbs. And we decided what wattage to use for those. This is the hall that you walked by when we went down to the parlor for coffee fellowship. Those are all LED bulbs there as well. And there's a fixture that has an LED bulb in it, and that's in the parlor. And Mark Miller, who is our music director, I think he's got a better title than that, but anyway, he's the one that has researched this and decided which bulbs go in which fixtures. And they look really, really nice. Those draw about 7 watts as compared to 60 watts from the old style bulbs. That's about the comparison between. This building uses monthly about $650 worth of electricity. When we went to LEDs, it actually dropped at maybe 21%. It's so hard because individually, season to season is not what it used to be. You know, with global warming, air conditioning is more. Last winter, 31 below zero with a wind. That was different than anything I can remember. So times are changing, so it's hard to make a comparison, but kind of the universal standard is 21% less usage if you use LEDs. Now, if you figure it out, this bulb and this bulb, this is 60 watts, that is 7 watts. So if you think about it that way, this should use quite a bit less than that, but in reality, it doesn't work out that way. It'd be great if it did, but it doesn't because you've got electric heaters, you've got some places have hot water heaters that are electric. There's so many things that we use electricity, and all of the electronics that you shut off still draw electricity. Otherwise, they wouldn't know when to turn on. They're always in the background listening. And so everything, if you want to eliminate the usage, unplug it. Because all computers, laptops, all that stuff, and those little plugins you put in the wall and plug a cord into to charge your phone, they draw about 2 watts continuously. So that's another thing we need to worry about. This is a chandelier in the parlor, and those are all LED bulbs as well. And they're on. This is the kitchen, and the kitchen has fluorescent light troffers on the ceiling. And this will show you now, don't go by the color, but go by these 2 bulbs. This is a conventional fluorescent bulb. The bottom one is an LED bulb. They look very pleasingly similar. The problem is this one draws 40 watts. This one draws 4 watts. There's a considerable difference. And this one, even though it's got the green ends on it, would mean it is less energy or less impact to the environment. It still has mercury in it, which is a poison. And this generates ultraviolet light that is converted by the material that's inside, which is a phosphor that glows. That is also a poison. So how do we recycle these to get rid of that? That becomes a real issue. And this is part of the problem that we're working with. I don't know how many years ago, our church decided we will not use recyclables. I mean, we don't use plastic that we throw in the garbage and recycle. We don't use paper plates and styrofoam cups. Everything we use that we can, we run through the dishwasher. You'll notice today when we started and we had coffee fellowship, we used reusable plates. I think this is really important that we do those kinds of things, because the problem we have, you know, I was listening and he was making a lot of sense, because where can we can't change the way the environment is unless we change the way we expect the environment to support us. The Green Chalice is a program that I believe we can all make a difference. We start out, and what we're doing is little by little, 1 light bulb at a time, or 1 plate by a time, or 1 spoon by a time, or, you know, the little things that we need to do. In your local communities, there's an awful lot. This morning on the news, there was a thing on CBS, and they were talking about lawns and what an environmental impact a lawn has. And what they were saying is, and then they showed pictures of flower gardens and things that take less water, and they help the environment instead of hurting the environment. You know, here we don't collect the clippings. Everything is mulched and goes back into the ground. That helps the environment quite a bit. We have right outside of this door, we've got a prayer garden, which took some of the green grass and turned it into something that's a little more productive. Later on today, we're going to talk about trees. And trees, grass, flowers, shrubs, all take the carbon dioxide that we exhale, and they convert it into oxygen, which we inhale. You know, when God put this world together, he had a plan that is unbelievable. The interactions between us and the world that he created for us. And with those concerns, the more we help the environment. You know, I'm sad in Lincoln right now, we're getting rid of a lot of the trees that have, well, there's several different diseases that the trees have. Some of the, oh my goodness, there was one in the backyard of one of my apartment complexes I take care of. I could not reach around the stump that is left. That tree was probably here 200 years ago, maybe. And it's gone because it was diseased. And for every tree we take out, we should plant 2 back, maybe 3, maybe 4. You know, the city is doing their part, but I think we need to do our part. Around here, we're fortunate. We've got quite a few trees on our property. But the thing about it is we can do more. We can always do more. You know, this lighting thing is a part of what we need to do for the environment. But the rest of it deals with what somebody this morning made a statement that I thought was so appropriate, you know, and that statement was, we can't look at what we have not done. We look at where we can go from here instead of beating ourselves up, saying, well, we can't do this, we can't. Yes, we can. We take it in little steps, one at a time. We can't undo the harm that we've done, but we can move from this point forward. You know, there was a thing that I read one time in the paper, and it said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and coming up with a different solution. A lot of churches are on that, you know, well, we've always done it this way, and we've got a $1,000 light bill. You know, what can we do to change that? Well, you can't use the same equipment. You got to change some things. Down in the basement that heats this building, there is a boiler that was built in 1952. It's Kawani, which is the brand name. And it's had a long life. It started out and there was coal that was shoveled into it by hand. And then it was oil. And then it was natural gas. And that's been updated with a different burner and several things that we have done. But if you go to your local church or your local home and look at the things that, okay, it's always been this way, but let's change. That's one of the issues we have in here. We don't want to change the look, but we want to change the technology. And that's what they started out when they did this crazy thing. Okay, this will replace that, because it looks the same. But then we have found that this is more pleasing to the eye. This is more functional. And when we redid our apartment buildings, we started out and our lights in our hallways and all of the apartments were this color. And a lot of people said, well, you know, it's kind of dark in the hallways. And so we went to this color, because it's more, your eyes work better with that light because that's getting closer to outside daylight, which is this one. And so now, as I'm changing bulbs, we're putting this in. Whichever one of these fits your particular situation, that's where you're going to have to start. You're going to have to look at our building and see the stairway, the first lights that we installed that were LED were the ones that shine on our beautiful stained glass window that is on 17th Street and those 16th Street. And those windows had 4 fixtures with these bulbs in it. They come on at dark and they burn till midnight. It's a real chore to replace those bulbs. If you can imagine putting an extension ladder from the floor of the up on the balcony, up on that beam, and then shinnying up there and changing those bulbs. Well, we got one burn, there was 4 of them, and 1 burned out, and then 2 burned out, and then 3 burned out, and then technology, those fixtures have been up 7 years. They came from Canada because they were a little ahead of the environment, and we put those up and everybody says, ooh, that looks different. And now 7 years later, nobody says that they look different, and they've been up 7 years, never had to change a bulb. But there's a fallacy about that. These bulbs are not forever. You know, that one of the things when we start putting into our apartment buildings, these lights, technology was that you have a fixture that you put up. The bulbs are not changeable. They're not bulbs. It's part of the fixture. And the LED, the light emitting diodes part, don't wear out. But the power supply that runs it, that's where the problem is. And you buy a cheap bulb for 79 cents a piece, it's LED, it's got 79 cents worth of parts in it. And in about a year's time, they burn out. Not because the LED failed, that's forever, but because what makes it work burns out. Another thing is, if you look on the packages that bulbs come in, some bulbs, we learned the hard way, are designed for enclosed fixtures or not. If it doesn't say enclosed fixtures capable or suitable, don't put them in because they get warm enough, they self-destruct. We have some bulbs. When I was a kid growing up, there was a bulb that looked like Edison had made it hanging in our parlor in our church. It had been there for a long time. And it had the little tip on it where they sucked the air out of, you know, that was, now they reproduce those. That was an original. And nobody can remember when that bulb was always changed, but that was a old type bulb. Nowadays, with technology, if a person puts the right bulbs in, they're almost forever as well, but don't expect them to last forever. Does anybody have any questions? Because as I wanted to be done with this so you can look at the lighting in the church. That was the plan for this. Look at this light, we've got it turned down now. It's very brilliant if we can turn it all off. We have lights that shine on the pipework, and those are LED bulbs. When we come back in here, we'll have all those lights so that you can see. Oh, recycling. Okay, we recycle everything we can. The only thing that won't go into city recycling is aluminum foil cans. I don't know, I don't understand that, but they are accepted. Aluminum can works, but taking it to the recycling centers, and there's one right down the street that I can't do The thing about it, where you live, if you happen to be an old like that, the local newspaper does recycling. I don't know how that ties together, but they do. And I need to go back here. Okay, we'll go back here, but then I get a feedback. Oh, well, anyway, recycling, if you recycle at home, then they'll take the aluminum foil, but the city won't take aluminum foil. I don't understand that, but every item that we can, all the bulletins, we've got a receptacle back here in the back, we put them in there, they go to recycle. All of the paper go, yes.
So in this presentation, try to remember especially things in the bottom place. Because there's stagnant. Everybody around
Back here. The one thing that we had trouble with was recycling fluorescent light bulbs. Echo stores used to be here in Lincoln, and Echo stores sold items that were recyclable, like cabinets, furniture, doors, you know, all that kind of neat stuff. And the company that owned the store wanted it instead. And so that went away, but we used to be able to take recycling there. Or take fluorescent bulbs there. There is another company here in town that is called Bulbs Plus Batteries, and they're down south part of town. They will take anything you want to recycle, they'll take, because they sell batteries and bulbs and all that kind of thing. Yes. You're looking at him. That, because we could have it done, but I prefer to do it on my terms because I just take it down to recycling. Yes. The problem, some places, they can only recycle some things, and that becomes an issue. These are the LED bulbs, they can be recycled. Now I bought, let's see, this bulb I just bought. It looks like a standard bulb, but it's plastic. And it's not glass. Yeah. Well, yeah.
But the other thing, one person asked about who all does the recycling at our church. Part of it's the ethos at our church. I think most of us participate in recycling. I have a recycling bin in my office. We have one in our main office. We recycle paper regularly. We have a couple different people who will take the recycling. Jim takes most of it that comes into our kitchen, but Donna Rule, our treasurer, takes a lot of our paper recycling. I take a lot of the paper recycling. I use the recycling bin where I live for that. So part of it is, I think it's part of the ethos here is that we are used to recycling and more than just Jim, that a lot of the congregation and the staff, it's part of our nature is we just go ahead and put it in the recycling bin. So so Jim is kind of our spearhead for that, but it's also an ethos here, I think, at the congregation that we try. So we aren't, like that person said, we aren't constantly shifting. Once in a while we are. Well, we have a couple of people that are very conscientious and they'll look in the garbage and they go, no, that doesn't go there. So they will move it, but for the most part, we're pretty good. But then Jim, another person had a question about, can you put if you have old fixtures for your LED lighting, say in your kitchen, can you put the new kinds of bulbs in those old fixtures?
Okay.
That she was asking
And
that.
that was one thing that I have in my pickup, something I was going to show you. This fixture inside there, the guts of it, it's just a tin can. Inside of it, it's a transformer. It's called a ballast. And the old bulbs, anything, you take an old bulb and put it in any fixture. But the new LED bulbs, they require what's called an electronic ballast. And every fixture you buy nowadays has electronic ballast in it. The old ones, they had nasty materials in there that PCBs were in there, which is a poisonous material. So those are no longer made. LES here in town had a program that this church went through, I don't know how many years ago, and all of the ballasts and all of the fixtures were changed to electronic ballasts. So when we got ready to do the kitchen, it was a matter of just taking one out and putting the other one in. It was a very simple thing. The change to an electronic ballast is really pretty simple if you've got anybody that has any skills, handyman type skills, because it's just a matter of matching colors of wire and putting it in. All of our hall lights, the fixtures that came had electronic ballast in it. So that part is an easy thing. I want to show you one thing, and that is that if you're looking for unusualness, if that's a word, and you can't figure out what color you would like to use for lighting, there are solutions to that. This is one, and you would be amazed. LED lighting does a lot of different things, but if you want, they come with a control panel. And if you don't like that, but you say, well, I think that the bulb should be, we can dim it. We can change color. We can make it, we can make it a white light. Or if you don't like that, but you do like a red light, you could have a red light. Or how about a green light? Or if you don't like any of those, how about, let's make it, there's a pretty blue. Well, it was a pretty blue, but it's just amazing all the different things you can do. And you can do it that way, you can do it any way you want to do it. But the interesting thing is LED is so changeable, and it's just amazing the things that can be done with it. I don't know that would have any, unless it was red and green for Christmas maybe, but the thing about it is your position in your community churches or in your home won't look right for everybody. And you've got to have some group of people, that looks really good, let's do it that way. Because there is no right color. There is no way to know what is the right color. But the thing about it is, there are so many things that are adjustable. Any other question? I'm watching time
And I wonder if anybody viewing us on live stream, maybe somebody there has a question. We haven't included them.
I don't know that. We had one that had a preference to
Okay,
live.
maybe not. I think as disciples, we got to have that on red. That's my thinking. Red that has to be. There you go. And I know Jim will show you around. I think also our lighting in the library. We just had that all redone.
The library has some really interesting lighting in it.
So you're happy, welcome to look around, and I know Jim will be happy to show you the highlights. We have done quite a bit here at the church, and we continue to work on that.
One more thing, LED lighting, when you dim it, doesn't change color. When these lights are dimmed, if you look at different ones, they aren't the same color. Some are dimmer than others. LED lighting, when you go in the parlor, as you walk in the door, On the, right inside the door, there's a dimmer, and that runs the lights in that part of the parlor. Play with it a little bit, because they don't change color. What they do is they just get dimmer, but the colors remain the same. Red, whatever color you like. Okay.
I'm your coach. You gotta
stand
behind the mic.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? We're right on schedule, I believe. 11:35, we're supposed to have a break. It is 11:31. Oh, sorry. You can do a lot of those. The three things don't have to be the same for every congregation. Here, what we have done is, one of the things is we have changed all of the public bathrooms all have automatic switches that when you walk out, they shut off. That was done because the only place in the church that nobody ever checks when they lock up is the bathroom. You know, all of our public bathrooms, now the ones that are in non-public spaces, those have conventional switches. That's one thing you can do. There's so many different things you can do. You can use a programmable thermostat to turn the heat down. This is done by a timer, not by a thermostat, the way the system is set up with the steam heat. But there's a lot of different things you can do. Three things, not the same three for every congregation.
But I think what she's asking is, what are the three things that First Christian here?
We
what
did
The
three things.
Yeah, but she's asking you to enumerate those three things.
Okay, the three things that we did the automatic shutoffs on the bathroom lights. We have converted everything that is technology-wise now with LED, and the third thing is recycling. Those are the three that we have done, but the three that you may find will be something different. Paul.
So just for people, anybody live streaming, Paul was reminding us there's a brochure about green chalice. It's in the resource area back when you do lunch. We can also be sure, if you're live streaming, that you get a copy, and the website is on that, and that has great suggestions. I think it's greenchalice.org. There you go, greenchalice.org, and you can get all that information.
There's so much out there. It's just unbelievable. This has everything you need to know in it. It really does. And that gives you the connection to the websites and everything. Any other questions? It is now exactly time for us to take a break. And we'll be meeting in the gymnasium.
So I think you're moving from break right into lunch, if I understood that.
Yes.
So
we got
actually
a
we're really breaking for lunch, and Jim's so busy, he's getting a reminder. And then we reconvene here at 12:30, is that correct? Yes.
Yes.
So, do make yourselves at home, do check out the lighting as you move through the church, and go ahead and move back through the parlor toward the gymnasium. That's where we'll be having lunch, and the resource tables back there. So we will reconvene in the sanctuary here again at 12:30. So all of you viewing can also take a break as well. So I think in order, so we don't have to do this in the room, was someone going to give a prayer for our lunch? Then let's just join our hearts together in a prayer of thanksgiving. Holy and gracious God, we give you thanks for the food we are about to eat, and we give you thanks for the hands that have so lovingly prepared it for us. Bless this food to our bodies as you bless this time of fellowship to our souls. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Now you can go eat with good, clear conscience.
And it's a pleasure to introduce you today to Martha Shulsky. Martha is the state climatologist, and she's going to talk to us about climate change and some of the issues that relate to that. Martha, thank you.
Thank you very much. This is the second time this week I have spoken in a church, and I never have before this week. So maybe somebody's trying to tell me something. I must say I grew up Catholic, and so being in this space, I don't know that I quite feel worthy. So, so this is my 22nd talk this year on climate change. And so if you think that people in Nebraska don't care about climate change, they do. I know that you all do, but there's a lot of people who care about this topic. So I'll just point out the picture that you see there. That is from Arthur, Nebraska, in Arthur County. Right now, that's one of our weather stations that we have. We have 60 of these around the state. So part of my job is to keep that network up and running. But right now in Arthur, it's 41 degrees with a northwest wind of 28 gusting to 40. So that's headed our way. We're gonna switch to cool sometime soon. So I'll be giving you an overview of climate change in Nebraska. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I teach a 100 level class at the university on climate change. And one of the things that we talk about is the fact that the Earth's climate is a system and it's very complex. I think that's one of the issues about climate change is it is so complex. There are no soundbite, easy answers. There's a lot of nuances to this. So when you think about the Earth's climate, think of it as this complete system. We have the landscape and what we're doing to the landscape. We're irrigating crops, we're building cities, all that lives on the landscape, the vegetation. We have the ocean. 70% of the world's surface is ocean. It's a significant heat storage mechanism. It redistributes heat around the world. So the ocean is very important. The atmosphere, the very dynamic atmosphere, which we're feeling today, things move very quickly. And that is where the extra blanket of greenhouse gases exist on Earth. That's how we're feeling climate change, is what's going on in the atmosphere. We have snow and ice. So I used to live in the far north. I spent 7 years at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and got a real flavor for what we call the cryosphere, is the cold part of the world. When we remove snow and ice, we absorb a lot more energy, and that further amplifies climate change or global average temperature. And the last thing to consider is people. We are a part of the Earth climate system. The level of uncertainty that we have actually in our climate models, that lowest bullet point, people and our behavior and what we will do or not do to combat climate change, that's the biggest uncertainty. In fact, if you think about how we model the Earth climate system, we actually know more about some of those other factors and less about what future human behavior is going to do. So this hopefully just kind of frames your mind and sets the stage of how to think of the Earth's climate. So let's start with what we know. This is probably a review for some of you, but from a scientific perspective, climate change is unequivocal. It is here and it is now. We're not waiting for it to happen. It's not just the polar bear on the ice floe. It's the flood of 2019. It's the fires of 2022. It's the heavy rain events that we experience. So climate change is real and it's here now. We're not waiting for it to happen. That's a tough thing to get through to a lot of people. Climate change is disproportional. That's the concern that I sense from a lot of faith-based communities that I speak with is those that are impacted the most are the least responsible for it. So elderly communities, indigenous populations, people of color, young people, sick people, these are populations that are feeling it the strongest and have the less capacity to deal with these implications. And then finally, and I cannot stress this enough, is that action must happen soon. In order to mitigate future climate change, we have to act now. So you've probably heard about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their 6th assessment report came out. A large report came out last December, and reports kind of keep coming out after that time. It's a way that the international community, scientific community, assesses the state of the climate. So I'm not a part of it, but people like me all over the world assess the state of the climate. I got a lot of questions asked about, what do you think about this report? What does it mean? And for me, the biggest takeaway is it means we have to act now. So that quote came to mind. I use that in my class when I talk about global climate models. This quote was by somebody who was accepting their Nobel Prize in chemistry research, in ozone in particular. So what's the use of having developed a science well enough if in the end, all we're willing to do is wait around for them to come true? Okay, so to me, that's this report coming out, this quote is definitely what came to mind. So let's think about Nebraska's climate past, and then we'll talk about Nebraska's climate future. So there's a lot more, obviously, that I could add to this. Nebraska sits at what I call the climate crossroads, right? It's a wet climate to our east, it's a dry climate to our west, and we're right in the middle. We're highly variable, and sometimes the noise is greater than the signal. So we go from hot to cold and wet to dry normally, but that is being amplified because of climate change. So in a nutshell, we're getting warmer, and that warmth is ramping up. Recent decades, the rate of change is increasing. Precipitation is increasing overall, less so if you are from in Western Nebraska, but Sandhills eastward, it is getting wetter. We're also getting more heavy rainfall events. So when we do get rain, it's happening more at one time, which creates erosion and makes it less effective precipitation. Less tends to soak into the ground if it comes in a heavy way. And then the weather is getting more variable and more extreme. Paul and I were talking before this, and I have never had the amount of media requests that I have just within this last week. There's fires, there's wind, the derecho in December that came through, if you remember that event, which was way out of context of when that normally happens. So we are getting more variable and more extreme. Yes, natural variability does happen. It will always happen, but what we are doing to the environment is speeding things up. It's amplifying our already variable climate. So what does climate change look like? If we think about the global average temperature increasing 1.5 degrees over the last century, we probably don't feel that trend. But what we do feel and how climate change plays out is through events, weather scale events, okay? So weather is what I'm wearing today. Climate is the clothes in my closet. Okay, so climate's the whole spectrum of weather, the day-to-day weather events that we experience. The flood of 2019, a rather extreme event, and that there was many factors that played into the setup of this very significant flood. Climate change plays a role in that. Wildfire smoke, I should have updated that to a picture more recently. We have fires in Southwest Nebraska right now. This one is from last summer. If for those of you that experience asthma, when there's smoke that comes to us from the Western US from wildfires where it's been hot and where it's been dry, which is amplified due to climate change, that's how we're feeling it. Or even think further away. Think of people having to move because their homes get destroyed, because sea level rises and their homes wash away. So things like hurricanes that become more intense because of climate change, people in those areas have to live somewhere. So where are they going to go? So our climate future, what Nebraska's climate, what the global climate will look like, that is up to us. It's based on our action or lack of action. You see two curves there. The orange one is what we absolutely have to avoid. If we assume business as usual, we don't change our behavior, that's what we're headed toward. To me, the scary thing about that orange curve, and you're seeing a model average as well as a spread, that's the lighter color on there. The scary thing about that is look at how that orange curve compares to the black lines. That's what we've observed. That's what we know, and that's what we think of our normal climate. So look at how far out of range that red curve is. Notice also that it continues to increase. It does not stabilize. To me, that's a really scary part, is how will we plan for an average situation when we just don't have it for very long? We're continually marching upward. So let's look at a better scenario. The aqua curve, that assumes that we put action into place in the very near term. Notice how things do stabilize. We will warm a bit more, but we will stabilize. The impacts that we will feel will be much more adaptable for that aqua curve than it will for that orange curve. So just arrows illustrating mitigation and no mitigation. So that's our options going forward. So let's think about our climate future. Just a few decades from now, when my kids are my age, my kids are 8 and 10 right now. When they're my age, if they're still living in Nebraska, we will warm by about 5 degrees or so. So here you're looking at the global differences in temperature compared to the current average annual temperature. So notice how you see darker colors all across the Arctic. So earlier I mentioned that snow and ice cover is a very important part of the Earth climate system. When that's taken away, you're absorbing a lot more sunlight. You're amplifying the climate change that occurs globally in those far northern regions. So Lincoln is projected to warm in a few decades by about 5.5 degrees. So that puts us at present day Wichita, Kansas. So that puts some context into that amount of warming that we're likely to experience. So let's think about precipitation. That's a lighter shading on that graphic, so it might be a little bit harder to see, but I'll explain what we're looking at. In general, because of climate change, wet climates will get wetter and dry climates will get drier. So if you have visited in the desert southwest of the US, that's going to continue to get drier. Kind of the eastern half of the US, that's going to get wetter. Nebraska is, again, I call it the climate crossroads because it's kind of on this dividing line. So Lincoln will get maybe 3 inches more precipitation than what we do right now. We average about 29 inches, so that will increase to about 32 inches. 12% wetter overall in the central US. You'll note those diagonal lines that are on that graphic. What that means is that there's more uncertainty in precipitation projections. It is more difficult to predict precipitation than it is temperature. Temperature is this nice continuous variable, but precipitation is discrete and it stops and it starts. So it can be very difficult to predict. That's why you see those hashed lines on there. So it gives you an indication of how certain or uncertain are the models. So to me, what's more interesting, rather than just looking at the annual average precipitation, because again, that might not be very meaningful to us. It's not something that we feel, but when and how we get our precipitation will change. So in general, when it does rain, we will get more rain at one time. So more precipitation will occur in these heavy, potentially flood-inducing rainfall events. Another projection of climate change, thinking about precipitation, is wetter during the colder time of year, drier during the summer, during the growing season. So from November through about April, we're going to get 15% wetter than what we are now, and then about 15% drier during summer. So to me, if I was an agricultural producer and we're going to warm by 5 degrees during the growing season, and we're going to be 15% drier during our wet time of year, I would be very concerned that my current cropping system couldn't handle that. So one thing to consider, so I talked about the Earth climate as a system and the fact that it is very complex, and there is natural variability that is always going to be in play. Sometimes that will tend to mitigate these trends that I talked about due to climate change. So an example of that is last February, if you remember what the conditions were like here and across the Central Plains, February of 2021. It was record cold. We had minus 24-ish temperatures for a large area of the Great Plains. We had rolling blackouts. We had power outages here in Lincoln, in fact. February, during the late winter, Nebraska has actually cooled by about 5 degrees in the last 30 years. So over the short term, we see a cooling in late February or late winter during the month of February. We tend to get more Arctic air outbreaks that time of year. The reason for that is actually climate change. Because the Arctic is losing ice, it is warming 3 times as fast as the rest of the world. When that happens, we get a wavy jet stream pattern. When we get a wavy jet stream pattern in the winter, we get more cold air. The cold air that was in the Arctic comes down here to the mid-latitudes. So this trend, this cooling trend, is actually tied to climate change. And I'll touch on something later where there was a lawmaker who was disagreeing with the science that I was telling some policymakers. So these 2 points are something that I talk about to any audience that I'm speaking with. And I've agricultural communities, municipalities, faith communities like yourself, the youth, insurance, there's a arborists, there's a number of different groups that reach out and ask, how will we be impacted by climate change and what can we do about it? So these are 2 things that I usually talk about with any group really, is that changes going forward will exceed what we've experienced in the past. So if you made a plan for a past climate, it will not work in the future climate. So your roadmap should be going forward. It should not be looking backward. And we can also hopefully think of this as an opportunity to maybe shift in another direction or think about something that we haven't, because now we're kind of forced to. So using this as kind of a threshold to think about transformational change. Okay, if we can't do what we've been doing in the past, let's use this as an opportunity for innovation and shift into an area that we haven't yet before. And that could play out differently for different sectors. Okay, so the last, I think I've got about 20 minutes left. My time's right. The last area that I wanted to talk about is perceptions of climate change. So I'm not a social scientist. My degrees are in meteorology and agronomy and soils and climate. But what I found myself doing, I've worked for a climate service organization for 20 years in Alaska and here. And I wish I had a background in social science, because dealing with people's perceptions is what I find myself doing the most. And perceptions do matter. Science is not enough. If it were enough, we would have solved this a long time ago. So what I try and do is really reach the group that I'm speaking with. And I'm telling you this so you can maybe utilize these tools in your conversations with people, or if you're trying to approach somebody who is on the complete opposite side of you and doesn't think that climate change is an issue, then hopefully some of these tools will be helpful for you. So what I try and do to some audiences is appeal to both the heart and the mind, because the data, the graphics that I just showed, it just might not be enough for some people. The infographic that you see there, that's from the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. They survey the US population every year to see how do people feel about climate change. You have the alarmed on one side. Some of you may fit into that category. And then you have the dismissive, those, I call them harmful. They're the 7% who whatever I say or anybody else says is not going to change their opinion. And they're actively fighting against climate change. This is the Exxon Mobil. This is the lawmakers who refuse to understand climate change. So I'll show you some survey results from this. You can get down to the county level, in fact, on this. This is from 2020. I apologize, I didn't update it for 2021 yet. The numbers are pretty close. So percent of adults, so 18 years, people 18 years older and up, think that global warming is happening. Nationally, it's 72%. That's the top number that you see. And then what I've done is put the number for Nebraska statewide here. So anything in the yellow and orange color is greater than 50%, greater than half. So anything in the blue color is less than half the population. So across the country, majority feel that yes, global warming is happening. I'm intrigued that they use the term global warming. That's not a term I would ever use in talking with any group in Nebraska. Percent of adults who think that global warming will harm future generations. Okay, so it's still a majority, but you can see the colors starting to get a little bit lighter. So you can just, I know you can't read the scale, but if you focus on the brightness of the color, you can get a sense of how this will shift as I go through these questions. Is global warming mostly caused by human activities? This should be 100%. Scientists are telling people this is absolutely correct. 52% in Nebraska. It's over 50, but it should be 100. So dive. Percent of adults who think global warming will harm them personally. This should be 100. It affects you, it affects me, it affects everybody in different ways. And we have different abilities to cope. So notice how most of the US, no, it doesn't harm me. California stands out there. Yeah. Yes, exactly, yeah. So for those on Zoom, we had a comment about how California, they have water issues. They've been in a multi-year drought, significant water management issues going on. So to me, that tells me they're feeling it. That's a way through lack of water. That's how we're feeling climate change. And they're getting that. They're understanding those dots are connected. So I would agree with that. Okay, so this last point I wanted to touch on in particular. Do we talk about global warming? We don't. It's 33%. All the country here has turned blue. So in the majority of the US population does not talk about climate change. And I completely understand that because it's not always an easy conversation to have. But we always talk about the weather, and weather and climate are very strongly related. Weather is how we feel climate change. Weather is the gateway to talking about climate change, in my opinion, especially in a place like Nebraska. So for me personally, as in my role as state climatologist, this is what I really try and stress. If somebody says, well, I don't know what to do. I understand you all talked about light bulbs earlier. You know, there's all these different solutions that we can implement, but don't underestimate the ability to have a conversation in a meaningful way about climate change. If we don't talk about it, we're not going to solve it. Okay, so I'll end these results on a positive. Should we regulate CO2 as a pollutant? Majority of the country says yes. 71% of Nebraska says yes, we should. So there's a way that we can talk about these solutions and talk about climate change. I just yesterday in my class, I gave a lecture on the Clean Power Plan and how that started. It actually started from the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. But CO2 has never broad scale been treated as a pollutant, as it needs to be at this point in time. Okay. So what I wanted to show is those were national results, a national polling system, and we did see some data for Nebraska. And so what I'm going to be talking about here is my experience. I'm not saying that it's scientifically valid. I'm saying after 6 years of being state climatologist and giving hundreds of talks to thousands of people, this is how Martha's perception of how people feel about climate change. So I was providing testimony for a bill, which actually I'll show in one of these next slides, that was going to produce an update to the 2014 climate report. Okay. To me, climate reports they have to be living documents. It doesn't do any good to produce it and then never revisit it, never revise it, because science evolves, things change. So I was testifying last February for this bill, and it didn't pass that year. It did pass this year, which I'm floored that it did. But there's a small group that I call harmful people. It could be people in positions of power, or maybe people that you know or in your family circle, that whatever you say, they are not going to understand climate change. These kinds of people in my opinion, do not need to be in a broad scale decision-making arena. That's where it's harmful. They're going to always exist, but please don't let them be an elected official. So then there's this other bubble that what I call active participants. So sometimes Citizens Climate Lobby, if you've heard of that group, so they are citizens who are concerned about climate change, and they, as their name states, they communicate with lawmakers. They talk to our congressional delegation. Sometimes they'll invite me along as the science voice. And I've had good, productive conversations with people like Deb Fisher. But this group and people like you, people that care about this topic, there's a significant percent of Nebraska that fit in this bubble, and increasingly so. This bubble is getting bigger. So that's a quote from, oh, I'm trying to remember what group that was, not Elders, maybe it was Elders for the Earth that I spoke with a few years ago. And then what I think is the biggest percent of the Nebraska population is what I call curious. Maybe they were once in that harmful, dismissive, apathetic, no, it's not happening category. But then something like the flood of 2019 happened. Then they think, oh, wait a minute, this is serious. What? We should be thinking about solutions here. We should be at the table and not on the menu. And we should think about local solutions and be a part of the conversation in an active, meaningful way. So this quote is from, I guess it's okay if I say, it's from the Nebraska Corn Board. I gave a talk to them in 2015 and then again in 2020, and the tone was completely different. Of course, some people were, the makeup was a bit different, but in 2019, I gave a talk to the Nebraska Farm Bureau. Okay, they invited me to talk about climate change. So there is movement in the positive direction, and this bubble is getting bigger. So I had put this quote in there. I'm reading a lot of books lately about indigenous communities and populations, and this was on a calendar in my office, and that quote really sticks in my mind a lot now, which, in the end, let us put our minds together and see what life we will make for our children. Let's think forward and not backward, and let's all work together. And then finally, I think my last slide here is on a positive note. This bill, it passed. The governor did not strike it from the budget. So an update to the 2014 climate report will happen. It is not a climate action plan, but we also need data to help decisions at the agency level, at private industry level. It can serve as a science-based background for plans that do take place. A climate action plan has failed for the last 5-6 years or so in this state. So I'm not real hopeful that in the near term that Nebraska can pass a climate action plan. Maybe a weather-ready Nebraska would be more successful, but regardless, at least I wanted to share a positive with you in a success story. So there's my contact information. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. You all are passionate about this. I'm passionate about this, and I appreciate the good conversation. So I'd be happy to take questions if there's time. Yeah.
So this morning, that said, as elders, we are guilt. More angry. So my question is, what you're teaching
Yeah, so the question is, what is the sense of younger people when they think about climate change? How are they viewing it and how are they handling it? They are angry. They are angry and upset. They're in some ways they're leading the fight in climate change locally. They hold people accountable. Their voice is different than the voice that I can have, and they're absolutely using it. I see a lot of anxiety, unfortunately, depression. It is impacting their mental and sometimes physical health. So that's kind of almost what I find myself doing is serving as like an advisor or mentor in that sort of way, and talking about turning anxiety into action and what are some ways that you can get around these feelings. And I tell people not to get discouraged. Maybe if they want to make a behavior change and they try and it fails, it's it's a process. It's not like you're all of a sudden going to do everything that will be good to save the planet, then everybody would have done it if it's easy. So just do one thing at a time and start small. But to get back to your question, they're what's going to result in significant action on climate change. I see it and have seen it increasing with my students. They're getting more and more angry about it. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, when people want to bring it back to weather, how do you pivot it toward climate? So something I think about, what my PhD student, he's doing some great work on perspective and looking at Nebraska's historical trends in weather events in relation to your age. So if you've experienced a large scale of weather events, then you're probably not noticing maybe this ramp up. But whereas if you're a younger person, then all you've known is this really strong increase. So that's one thing to maybe consider or think about, is what age group is the person you're talking to in. And then I would, because I've heard things like that before, I would say, let's say that person is a producer, say, so do you, have you changed your seed hybrids any? What sort of changes have you implemented on your farm? Because you've noticed a trend, or get them to talk about if they have experienced some sort of trend in it. If somebody is very, kind of the opposite of where I am, the more I can get them to talk and kind of understand what is it that they care about, where they exactly are they coming from, and then I find I can kind of move the conversation in a better direction. Another thing would be talking about, that's interesting. And did you know that climate actually drives weather events? That determines the sorts of weather that we feel. Weather and climate, they're cousins, but they're not the same person. They're not the same thing. So those are just some ideas, and just recognize that it may be somebody that you just can't convert, or maybe there's another issue that they also care about that's related to maybe economics, or something like that, or their health. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The 30 by 30 plan. Yeah, to me, it's, yeah, and I understand there's a protest going on, just walk away as we're talking about this. Well, I disagree with how the governor feels about this. And I think some people, they're framing this or they're thinking of it as a way of kind of federal domain or hands-on. But to me, it's really more of a conservation issue and thinking about our natural resources. What do we want to preserve? What do we want to pass on to future generations? I'm sure if you ask a rancher in the Sandhills, I'm sure they would say, yes, we manage our grasses so that we don't overgraze. We think about the health of our resources so that it can survive. We can make it through this drought and we can survive to the next year. Unfortunately, it's something that is being made political when it really isn't, and is an overall positive for us. I would, in this case, I wouldn't try and convince the governor otherwise, because I don't think that would actually happen. I'm just, okay, let's work around this and say, well, do you think we should conserve our water resources? Do you think we should limit erosion? Do you think we need to be good stewards of the earth? Should we think a few generations ahead? So I would kind of pivot away. If this is a hot button issue, it really doesn't do any good. Just pivot away from it. I'm sorry, that didn't really answer the question great, but. Yeah, as I understand it, it is. It's voluntary. It's not like a Fed is going to come to your property and say, you must do this, you must do that. It is misunderstood, and or it's taken in the wrong direction so that people won't support it. So that's really the problem. Yeah. So, okay, so probably what they're, which would not really, you're still flying, so in an emission sense, you're still contributing. Probably what that comment is, when you fly, you have the possibility to generate contrails or condensation trails or clouds. In some cases that can warm the surface. In some cases that could reflect more sunlight and cool the surface, but it depends on area and time of day and season and things like that. So that's a pretty broad statement that somebody's taking one aspect of that and making a big generality. Well, so I think the statistic is 40 food waste. Yeah, I mean, 40% of food is not consumed in a global sense. So, if you think about the production and processing and transport of that food that was ultimately thrown, let's say it was put into a landfill, and then it's going to decompose and also generate potentially greenhouse gases. So, yeah, I don't know if those equate, but even if we tackle food waste, that would be a significant help for climate change. But again, how it compares to the overall aviation industry as a whole, I'm not exactly sure. See, I learned that every time I give a talk, I get ask these questions and say, I don't know the answer, but I'm gonna log it because I'm sure I'll get asked that again. Yeah.
It seems like the winter still high, it's dusty at such high level.
Yeah, they are. Okay, so the question was about high winds, and is that because of climate change? So I would say that plays a role. So some of my colleagues in the National Weather Service, they looked at trends in wind speed during winter and spring for Nebraska and did find an increase in wind speed over time. So there would be some sort of climate change signal with that. This time of year, we tend to get these big synoptic, big large scale storms because it's still, I mean, North Dakota is getting blizzards, so it's still very cold, not, a few states to our north, and it's very hot and dry to our south. When you get a temperature difference, ultimately that leads to pressure difference and high wind events. But it does seem, and I think the data seem to verify that it is much more windy than usual this year. I had given a talk to the renewable energy conference in Nebraska a few months ago, and I looked at climate projections. So going a few decades into the future, looking at wind and sunlight. So trying to apply it to the renewable energy industry. And wind speeds, if we go further decades into the future, we're likely to experience less wind speed overall. Not to say that we won't have storms, but just overall compared to winds, how they are now, that we're likely to see a decrease in wind speed. Again, but that's decades into the future. And I think we're feeling the winds now more because it was the fourth driest winter on record in Nebraska. We had very little snow cover, nothing is planted in the field, so we're feeling it, and fires are happening, and so there's a lot of impacts because of the high winds. So.
Thank you, Martha. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Yes. Certainly enlightened us a great deal.
Yes. I know you're extremely busy. Are you, if we have your contact information there, are you available maybe coming out to local churches or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Not a problem.
10-minute break. And we'll have our conversation.
Today was fun because after working with Jack on the computer, I finally got a chance to meet him today. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but I'd like you guys to welcome Jack Hilger, and he's from UNL. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. I feel I've watched Martha Shulsky present before, Dr. Shulsky, and so I feel like I have really big shoes to fill to close out this afternoon. So my apologies if I may not sell the end of the show. But if you have any, my name's Jack Hilgert, and I work for the Nebraska Forest Service. And we are a department of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So very similar probably to maybe what Martha might have mentioned, like the state climatology office. We are similar in the fact that we are a state agency, but we are housed out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And so then I'm therefore also an employee of the university. So if you have any questions throughout the time that we have together, or discussion points or things that I mentioned that you want more clarification on, both in person and virtually too, Just feel free to interject as much as you want. I always prefer more discussion than less. I just like the slides, so it kind of keeps me on my path here this afternoon while we're together. So again, my name is Jack Hilger, and I'm the Conservation Education Coordinator for the Nebraska Forest Service. And a large portion of my position is being the state coordinator for 2 environmental education programs in Nebraska, Project Learning Tree and Project WET. And like I mentioned, the Nebraska Forest Service, our little logo is down here, and you'll see it throughout the slides, is a department out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, housed out of the Institute for Agriculture and Natural Resources. My office is located within Forestry Hall on the east campus of the university here in Lincoln. That's where our headquarters is right behind the East Campus Union. If you've been over there, that first little building out the doors by the parking lot, that's our building. But we also have staff in counties all across the state, housed out of extension offices or NRD offices as well. So it's great to be here with you this afternoon. And our mission at the Forest Service is to enrich the lives of all Nebraskans by protecting, restoring, and utilizing Nebraska's tree and forest resources. One thing that's a best practice for us at the Nebraska Forest Service and part of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln is to do a brief land acknowledgement statement at our public workshops and presentations. So as being part of the university and serving the entire state of Nebraska, our land acknowledgement statement is rather lengthy. So I won't read it word for word from the slide, but we want to acknowledge as the state forestry agency, the historical indigenous communities that resided across the state of Nebraska and the present communities that still reside within our state, and how we want to make better relationships with those communities going forward in our effort to serve all Nebraskans. If you're interested in how the University of Nebraska crafted our land acknowledgement statement as a university, I have the link down here that talks about the different indigenous groups that the university worked with Chancellor Ronnie Green and others at the university headquarters. And then I also always like to include a link here that's from the Bureau of Indian Affairs from the federal government. And they actually have a great pool of resources if you're interested in crafting your own land acknowledgement statements for your own organization. So again, just something we like to do as best practice. So here's our little roadmap for this afternoon. I'm going to go into a brief history of forestry in Nebraska. I know next week is Arbor Day, and so we have actually next week is going to be the 150th anniversary of the very first Arbor Day that was ever celebrated, both in the country and in Nebraska. We'll also talk about a little bit just about what the Nebraska Forest Service is and what we do as an agency, and finally wrap up with some of our current challenges that our trees and forests face all across our state. So, and like I mentioned, as we dive into this content, feel free to interject and interrupt as much as you want. Can everyone hear me okay too, both in person, I think, and on the Zoom? Good, okay, well. A brief history of forestry in Nebraska. So as long as there have been people in the state of Nebraska, right, there's been a relationship between those people and the trees that reside within our state. So of course, with our written history, and we actually have a whole, if you're interested in a lot of the nitty-gritty details, we have a whole book about the history of the Nebraska Forest Service and the history of forestry in our state. That's available at Forestry Hall at our agency's headquarters. But I won't go into all the details this afternoon. But there's some interesting dramas and things that happened along the way. But even before this written history, of course, right, there is a history of the indigenous communities that lived in our state interacting with our trees and forests. So whether that was in direct utilization of using parts of trees for their houses and where they lived, or using them for their food that they ate, or also indirect relationships through their land management practices. We're learning a lot more now with natural resources, how indigenous populations in Nebraska more than likely used wildfire and almost pseudo-controlled burns to help control our native prairies before colonization, and that indirectly would have decreased the number of trees on the landscape as well. So just recognize that as long as there are people within our communities and there are trees, there's going to be a relationship between those two pieces. So here's a few important dates that I just wanted to share that kind of help tell the timeline of forestry in Nebraska. So early in the 1800s, since Nebraskans began to, colonize our state with Western expansion, they really began to bring trees along with them from the East Coast and plant them in our communities across the state. On the next slide is another date that I have. In 1872 was the very first Arbor Day, right? That was founded by J. Sterling Morton of Nebraska City. And so from a very, very early time period, our citizens have appreciated trees and one had a desire to increase the number of trees on the landscape. In those early years, a lot of that was due to, like we experienced probably this afternoon, the high winds across the landscape and trying to create windbreaks across the state, not only to help decrease the battering down of our dwelling places, like our houses, but also to help eventually decrease things like soil erosion after the Dust Bowl in the mid-1900s. That led up to the passage of the Clark-McNary Act in 1924 that really kick-started heavy tree planting across the state of Nebraska that was funded by the federal government in response to the Dust Bowl earlier of the early 19th or 20th century. So under that federal piece of legislation, there was kind of the first heavy investment at the university in establishing extension forestry. So there was the extension forester who would eventually become kind of part of what our agency is today, working with communities all across our state to help plant trees, both in cities and towns where people live and play and work, but also in agriculture landscapes, right, with windbreaks and shelter belt programs. Later on, as time went by, those programs expanded and oftentimes really heavily relied on federal funding, but did have some university and state level support, where the state, was funneling money through the Nebraska University to do this work in Nebraska Extension. Later on in the 60s, so 1967 was when it was passed in the legislature, there was some forestry work that was also in tandem being done by what would become the Nebraska Game of Parks Commission. So in 1967, basically the unicameral said, why are we having two departments do the same thing in different parts of the state? And so moved the state forest, created the state forestry division and moved it within the university where there was just a larger pool of money to draw from that federal Clark-McNary Act funding, and also just a longer historical relationship with working with communities across the land. In 1977, that became what was called the Forestry, Fisheries, and Wildlife Department at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and was the precursor to the modern School of Natural Resources, where actually Martha Shulsky and the state climatologists are housed. And so at that time, it was kind of the natural resource school, and also not only trying to educate future professionals in those degree programs of forestry, fisheries, and wildlife, but also do that extension heavy style work of serving Nebraskans. Over time, right, as those programs grew even further and evolved, it was found by the 1990s that it was just too much for one department to do, right? Some folks within the department were very heavily invested in the teaching aspect of preparing future professionals and providing that, undergraduate and post-undergraduate education to students. And some were very focused on serving the public. And so the university at that time then split the department up into what is now the School of Natural Resources, focusing on that undergraduate and post-undergraduate education resources, and then the Nebraska Forest Service, focusing on that public service elements of our agency. And then in 2009, the Nebraska Forest Service also absorbed Nebraska Statewide Arboretum. So the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum is a network of arboretums all across our state in communities that are affiliated as affiliate sites, and then gives hopefully access to Nebraskans all across our state to trees, and a diverse amount of trees in communities in almost every single county. So, which is very unique. We're the only state in the country with a statewide arboretum. All of the other states have what is called a state arboretum. So similar to like the state parks or the University of Nebraska Memorial Hall, right? Kind of a state museum, but a state living museum for trees. Instead, here in Nebraska, we have this integrated system that integrates arboretums into numerous communities across our state instead of just at one single site. So that's kind of, I know, a lot of data and information. A few other important dates that relate to forestry as it's evolved in our state is that, of course, in 1872, J. Sterling Morton founded the first Arbor Day in Nebraska, really trying to get public support out there for planting and caring for trees. In 1972, so 100 years later, and this year's their 50th anniversary, the natural resource districts were created by the Nebraska legislature. And each NRD across the state also has its own forestry program that they work in tandem with us at the Forest Service to help provide trees in those agricultural landscapes, especially so seedlings for windbreaks and windbreak utilization and other programs as well. And so basically the NRDs over time absorbed some programs that had been done purely by the Nebraska Forest Service just because they have a more community-based presence across the state. Whereas, you know, in the past, people were ordering trees from the state forester here in Lincoln, right? It makes more sense for them to order from the NRD office in their own county or in their own community. So, and then at that same year, the Arbor Day Foundation was created in 1972. And I think it was mentioned that Arbor Day has already kind of shared some resources with you. So Arbor Day Foundation, of course, is headquartered in Nebraska City, where J. Sterling Morton lived here in Nebraska. They work with us as a partner on different programs, and we administer their Nebraska tree planting effort program called Tree City USA, which I'll talk about a little later. So lots and lots and lots of different groups over the years have been involved in tree planting in Nebraska. I always like to say that in conservation, like partnership is probably the #1 word, because really, right, one of us as an entity or organization can accomplish some things, but we can always accomplish more when we work together. So do we have any questions about anything I shared here? I know it's kind of a dense subject matter area, so hopefully the next bit is a little bit more lively. No questions? And let me look, I'll pull up the chat box too, just so I can see if any questions pop in the chat. Ooh, no. There we go. Okay, well, if not, we will keep on going. So what is the Nebraska Forest Service? Oftentimes, if I go like to the grocery store after work or stop at the gas station, right, and I have my like Forest Service hat on or my windbreaker on, and it has our little logo on it, people are like say, oh, you work for we have a Forest Service in Nebraska. What do you guys do all day? I'll sit around the same tree. So you know, I'm no stranger to those jokes, and so it's always nice to say, well, yes, we do have trees in Nebraska, right? And we do then have someone has to help take care of them, and that's our agency's job. So we have a myriad of different major programs that hopefully help to serve the public in Nebraska. We are a little bit different than many other states by comparison. We're not what would be considered a traditional forestry state. And that would be someplace like Florida or Georgia or California, right? Where they have large swaths of forested land that are very heavily managed for forest products production, right? Pulp and paper products, wood flooring, and everything else like that. In Nebraska, since again, I mentioned we're 97% private, or I may have mentioned that earlier, there were 97% privately owned across the state. 97% of all land in Nebraska is owned by private citizens. Our forestry programs are a lot more public focused on helping those private citizens manage their trees and forests in a responsible manner. So our major program is what we call rural forestry, right? And this is maybe what you think of when you think of forestry here in Nebraska. This is where we have what we call rural foresters or conservation foresters housed all across the state. So every community and every county has a forester that is assigned to them. And that forester works within and with that community to help with tree planting efforts, especially focused on things like windbreaks and shelter belts and that agricultural intersection with forests. But they also are kind of the on the ground community presence in that area of the state to help enact many other programs too. Our other major program that we work with all across the state of Nebraska is called Forest Health. And every state forest service across the country has a forest health department and forest health program. This is where we're monitoring the health of our trees and forests and understanding what major threats those trees and forests are facing when it comes to their health. And so we oftentimes help answer sick tree calls where community members call our foresters and have them, take a look at their trees. I always like to joke that our forest health foresters, I call them the tree doctors, because they just are constantly emailing people back and forth or answering things on Facebook Messenger or things like that, where people are like, my tree's doing this, is it dying? Or, what should I do better with this tree? So besides those individual trees, right, they work with a forest, the roots of trees as well, to help overcome some issues. Examples that come to mind here in Nebraska are things like pine wilts that we might experience. So when we have large swaths of pine trees that pass away, the emerald ash borer, which I'll discuss later, and other either invasive pests or diseases. We of course have a forest products utilization program. And so that just is focused on helping to increase the utilization of forest products in Nebraska that are grown in Nebraska, right? We want to think of a tree as a resource that we can use throughout its life. And so when we have a tree that we plant, we might be planting it for a windbreak or for just the aesthetic appeal in a community. But we also want to hopefully think of what comes next after that tree is done with its life, right? And how we can hopefully help utilize that forest product in the future. So while we're not traditionally known for a huge lumber supplying and things like that, we do have a number of private sawmills across the state that we work with and just working to support growing that sector in Nebraska. A major hot topic, no pun intended, in our agency and across the state, right, is our wildland fire program. So the Nebraska Forest Service administers the state's wildland fire prevention program with a couple other state partners like NEPA and NEMA. And what we do is we provide all of the training to the firefighters across the state, both that are paid and volunteer fire departments in rural communities, about how to fight wildland fires. We also supply a lot of different materials, so surplus, usually it's Army military surplus materials that we've kind of repurposed for wildland firefighting, and then we loan that out to those firefighters across the state and communities, so that way when fires come up, we can help. Those are, direct resources that we've loaned to them. And then we also have a series of programs that are more future focused, right? Those previous that I was mentioning, right, are about how do we fight the fires that are happening today. We also have programs, of course, where we're focusing then on how do we fight the fires that are coming tomorrow. And one of those that's really big is called is where we work with a private landowner or even public landowners like Nebraska Game and Parks Commission to do what we call fuels reduction. And so fire is a natural part of the landscape, and it's a natural part of our ecosystem here in Nebraska. So what we are trying to do is mitigate the extreme effects of wildland fires and their severity within an ecosystem or on the property. And so what we do is we help landowners with managing their forests. So that way, if a fire does start, it does not destroy the forest and also has less likelihood of being so severe that it destroys, you know, human lives and human property as well in that process. So basically in California and Colorado and some of those farther western states, right, where we hear about wildfires all the time, the reason why those fires are so severe is because they're what we call crown fires. So just like, you know, a king or a queen might wear a crown on their head, we call the top of the tree, it's the head of the tree almost, it's crown. And so when the wildfires out west are so severe, it's because the fire has fuel on the ground. So basically fallen logs or dead trees that were not removed properly after they fell on the ground. And so when fire comes through, the fire can be intense enough to jump up into the top of the tree, right? If you drive down I-80 or you drive down a highway here in Nebraska and you see our big majestic cottonwoods, right? You'll notice that as fully grown cottonwood, they don't have any branching about 8 to 10 or 12 feet even off the ground, right? Because our prairie trees evolved with fire over time. So that way the fire can go in on the baseline where the grasses are, but will not jump up through the branches into the canopy. And so what we do is we work with landowners across the state to help, you know, keep up with their private lands. So that way, if in case there is a fire in the future, right, it's not going to do the same thing and jump up into the crown. We also have a sustainable landscapes program, and that's how the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum relates to our mission. We work with communities all across the state on how do we create more healthy landscapes and communities by doing tree planting efforts within urban settings and also community garden work, native planting, rainwater control gardens, things like that. Programs that just make our communities more sustainable places to live. And then finally, my program, conservation education. And so in conservation education, I always say we achieve our agency's mission by connecting Nebraskans, especially focusing on Nebraska's youth with their trees and forests to help inspire the next generation of conservation stewards and tree planters in Nebraska. So I know that's like a lot of content as well there. Do we have any questions about some of our major programs at the Nebraska Forest Service?
Do you have any association with Halsey National Forest?
That's a really good question. So Halsey, again, like you said, is the national forest, one of our 3 national forest landscapes in Nebraska. So it is managed by the Federal Forest Service, which is housed out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But we do work with them on different projects and programs or provide technical expertise on some other other landscapes. For example, in the Kelvey National Forest, which is outside of Chadron, Nebraska. Again, that's a federal forested land. There was a severe wildfire in 2012. And so we work heavily with the Federal Forest Service, local NRD and other partners on like reforestation effects even 10 years later after that fire. Also, when you purchase a tree from your local NRD, or we use the NRD tree program to help with tree planting programs that we administer, all of those trees were sprouted and started at Halsey at Bessie Nursery. So it's the oldest continuous federally funded nursery in the country. So almost since the National Forest was founded in Halsey, they've been growing trees at Halsey. And so Halsey Nursery provides seedlings for a really large portion of the country. So their tree program on average produces about 2 to 4 million seedlings every year that go to North and South Dakota, Colorado, Montana, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, and a little bit of Minnesota at present. So I was actually just there last month for a different program I was hosting, and they're building on some new facilities as well. And so they estimate once those are done within the next couple of years, they'll probably increase their annual production to about 5 to 6 million trees. And those trees, again, go out to states all across the country, especially in our Midwest region, to help, again, replant from wildfires, planting windbreaks, and all of those different programs. So. It depends on who's the landowner, right? So all the trees that are on our like state highway system are managed by, or basically owned by, the State Department of Transportation. So I do know that they do have some funds for like landscape management every year. But we don't at present. In some other states they do, but at present in Nebraska, we don't have like a Department of Transportation forester or something. And in some of those more heavily forested states, they do actually have someone on that department that usually is more tree focused, but we just don't have that in Nebraska at present. We do provide them on occasion, when they ask us for technical advice or assistance, we will always provide that, but we don't work with them really directly on a regular basis. And then if it's like trees within a city, a lot of the times those trees are managed by what is called your city forester and your tree board, which is part of our Sustainable Landscapes program, the Tree City USA program. So Tree City USA is a national program that's sponsored by the Arbor Day Foundation, but in Nebraska, we administer the program. So it's like a lot of different people in Nebraska doing this one program. But basically, we work with communities all across the state, and to be an active member of the program, you have to have a tree board. And so that's usually a volunteer board in many of our smaller communities. And in communities like Lincoln and Omaha, they have, a paid city forester or arborists who are kind of fulfill that role, and they help advise the city on what trees to plant, how to manage those trees and things like that. And then you have to spend, depending upon your level within the program, so much per capita or citizen of your community on tree management on an annual basis. And so we administer that program in Nebraska on behalf of Arbor Day Foundation. And so we have two what we call community foresters who really are heavily focused on working with trees in towns and communities, remember, where people live, work, and play. And those foresters are located in Omaha and Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and they kind of run that program at our agency. So, yeah. But again, if it's something that's, a municipal tree, as a citizen of that community, you have as much as voice of anyone in that tree's management. So, bringing those concerns up to your local municipal, staff members, or even your city council can help, with the management as you see, as you are desiring that management to be.
Say, in cases where churches, we definitely can start small. All that. So from the environmental standpoint, are there places to go that would
Mhm.
for church budgets.
Yeah.
We as church, you know, start.
That's a good question. So our Nebraska statewide Arboretum programs really help work with community groups like that to help on their programs. So we have the Arboretum and our Forest Service professionals have whole lists of recommended trees for different and other, you know, like perennials, pollinators, things like that, pollination plants for different regions of the state of Nebraska. So that way, if you're looking for native plantings, we can help recommend what species, you know, to pursue. Our statewide Arboretum does sell and provide some seedling trees and native plants and grasses to, you know, private individuals and organizations across the state. And we do have some grant funds that we administer to help community groups offset some of those costs as well. But if we can't help you out too, we're always happy to help, you know, direct you to other folks who might be able to, if maybe that's outside of your budget or we don't have a grant that can help kind of offset some of those costs for your organization. And like another great example to reach out to would be your local natural resource district too. I know a lot of those folks, especially the 2 weeks around Arbor Day, do a lot of tree giveaway sort of things where they're giving them out to school children, local community groups and things like that. And so there's definitely people out there who can help you out. So, but we do work with organizations. And so if you are interested in any of our programs, you can just go to our website, nfs.unl.edu, and then go from there to explore more which you're interested in. And we can do anything from providing like the landscape design, you know, advice in a community project to what species to plant, and even providing, again, like I said, some of that maybe cost share, grant funding, or even the physical plants themselves. So it just depends on the project or program. One that comes to mind right now off the top of my head that might be really attractive for your groups as like churches, especially if you have like parochial early child development centers right on your properties. We have a program called Bloom Box that's focused on giving low cost or no cost trees and or pollinator gardens to those sorts of groups. So schools and childcare centers. And so that might be a program on there to really explore further too. Because those are really they're great pollinator gardens to start with because it's a pretty small plot that you'll start with, but they grow up pretty fast too, so. That's a good question. If you didn't hear on Zoom, he asked basically what are there other trees that might be better or worse for the environment with different aspects? And so did you mention like CO2? Yeah, and so at the Forest Service, what we always say is we are hoping to what we want to do is if we're doing our due diligence, we want to put the right tree in the right place at the right time. So it depends on a lot of factors, right? A tree that grows in southeastern Nebraska, right, in Falls City, like we have like a lot of American sycamore, right, in the southeast and even up here in Lincoln, right? American sycamore is a great tree, but out in Chadron, unless it's being, you know, really heavily maintained as like an urban tree within the city limits, it's not probably going to fare so well, right? And so we take all those environmental conditions into our process of when we're trying to select a tree, right? Or when we try to help in private individuals or organizations select trees to plant. And then also what do those individuals want out of their tree, right? Some of our trees are going to have a lot better branching structure for windbreaks. And so they're going to prevent, you know, more wind from getting to your house or getting to your barn or, you know, blowing the topsoil off of your field. Whereas some trees are going to provide more of an aesthetic value with, you know, flowers or fruits, things like that, or wild wildlife. Some trees are going to have better food for things that you might be interested in either having there for the aesthetic values or for hunting, like wild turkey and deer, whitetail mule deer. So it just really depends on what the, the management priorities are in that case by case basis. There is some evidence that like broadly based, that there are some species that we do believe absorb more carbon faster from the atmosphere than others. But that's still like kind of a really broad data set, and it's a very new segment of like forestry science. So I don't know if necessarily, I'm sure that we take those things into effect and probably will continue to do so, right, in the next 10 to 20 years. But I don't think we have like a playbook per se, of here's trees in Nebraska that are going to be the best for carbon mitigation, or carbon sequestration, I should say, which is just where carbon dioxide is being drawn out of the atmosphere and into the tree as a physical state instead of a gas. So, but really any tree is going to do that too. So I know it's kind of a long-winded answer. Those are all really great questions. Do we have any other questions before I move on?
This area of the United States used to be heavily forested at one point, and so their goal for multi-national forest was to be forest access. That's not relevant. Is that a part of the vision of your department now? Get all these Nebraska forested?
I guess so. Halsey was created through a number of different ideas. Basically, Charles Bessie, who was the precursor to the state forester at the University of Nebraska, believed that the sandhills would be really great for planting trees, which they are. The sandy soil is really great for drainage, and the climate there is really good for planting, especially for growing coniferous trees, so trees with needle-like leaves. And at the time, especially with the forest policy that was in place in the Southeast and in the far West, there was a lot of anxiety about lumber availability in the long-term future. And so they had basically persuaded the federal government to pass the Clark-McNary Act to establish Halsey as a federal forest reserve. So in case the western forests were decimated to the point where they would not return, that was like did not become the case due to activism like from John Muir and what would become the modern conservation movement across the country, and instead of preservation. But anyways, they also created Halsey because they thought in that part of our state, it would create a more microclimate and increase rainfall in the direct east of Halsey Federal Forest, which would then increase the access of that land for row crop agriculture instead of pasture rangeland. And on top of all that, they thought it would also, again, help with wind, they wanted to expand Halsey further than it currently is, to help decrease the amount of wind and things like that across the state. So there's like a lot of ideas. Really, the sandhills in their natural state are not really covered by trees, so they should be covered by grasses. And so now the Federal Forest Service is working to maintain Halsey where it is, but they're not really growing more trees past what are currently there at Halsey. I mean, they still do a lot of tree growing at Halsey that then like those trees go out to all these other forests across the country. But, I don't know how long ago it was, but the U.S. Federal Forest Service is now called the U.S. Forest and Grassland System. And so they're also managing Halsey as both a forest and a grassland. So Yeah, that's a lot of information, but we are heavily involved all across the state in like tree planting efforts. I think something that our state forester really likes to say is that, you know, our communities across Nebraska and really across the country face a lot of challenges today. And one great answer to many of those challenges is planting and maintaining trees. And we'll talk about some of the challenges that our trees face here in a little bit. And so whether that's in a more rural setting, like over by Halsey, or in an urban setting, you know, we're always going to advocate for planting more trees at the Forest Service.
I want to thank you very much.
Oh.
You're trying to be on schedule, so.
Oh, that's okay.
We have 15-minute break and then the meeting after the worship service. Thank you very much.
No problem. If you have any questions or anything, I had my contact info on the last slide, but I'm sure that your organizers can share it with you too. So, and then again, go to our agency's website for any more information about any of the programs you heard about today. So, and have a happy Arbor Day next week. Go home and hug your trees and all of that.
Our closing worship service, I wanted to take a minute to do a couple of things, one of which will be the mechanics around communion, but even before that, I want to say thank you to the planning group. Paul, Lisa. The content of this retreat has been amazing. It's been really well done. It's grounded in the practical of the church with a lot of good information from really good resource people. So hats off. This has been a great retreat. I hope we do something like it again, because I think word will get around that this is really well worth people's time. It's good for the church and it's good for the soul. As we turn our attention to our soul, one of the ways we nourish our soul as disciples is we have communion every time we gather. And many of us are familiar with the handy dandy version of communion, but just in case, Jim has been kind enough to allow me to teach you. You will come up, everybody will come up and go in front, and the communion elements will be available to you here at this table.
Works better if you take the lid.
That does help. Jim's such a practical guy. But you simply use one finger to pull down on the hard tab, and that cellophane tab will be there for you to then just lift up, and that will get you the bread. Then when you've got the bread in your mouth, you pull the hard tab back. I'm not going to do that now. We've got the containers. Thanks, Wayne. And you pull the tab back and you drink it. And there's a container there now, but there's also one over there to give you time to partake of the elements. If you'd rather go back to your seat and do that instead of trying to navigate it while you're walking, that's fine. But there'll be containers there and there. There's another one up here. So there's plenty of places to throw away the container when you're done. Hopefully that is clear, but certainly understand if there's fumbling, but feel free to take it back to your seat and celebrate communion. And so we are gathering. I will sit down.
Are we ready to start?
We're ready for you.
If you join me in the call to worship as is printed in your bulletin, let us gather together to give thanks to God. Though Jesus Christ, or through Jesus Christ, a new creation is being brought to perfection. We participate with God in this new creation. May our hearts, minds, bodies, and spirit be open to learn.
May we never
May we embrace the depths. And animals who walk and swim upon the
The scripture reading today is Psalms 104, verses 10 through 15. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal. The wild asses quench their thirst. By the streams, the birds of the air have their habitation. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle and the plants for people to cultivate, to bring forth food from the earth, and the wine to gladden the human heart, oil to make the face shine, and bread to strengthen the human heart.
For our intercession, please join me in the bold-faced printing. You delight in creation, its color and diversity, yet we have misused the earth and plundered its resources for our own selfish ends. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
You have brought order out of chaos, light in darkness, good out of evil. But we have preferred darkness in words and deeds which dishonor your holy name. Christ, have mercy.
Christ, have mercy.
You have showered us with blessings, but we have been grudgingly towards others and lacking in generosity in word and deed. Lord, have mercy.
Peace of God be with you. Our scripture, you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands.
Teresa and Mike, do you want to come join me at the table? As the grain once scattered in the fields and the grapes once dispersed on the hillside are now united on this table in bread and wine, so Lord, may your whole church soon be gathered together from the corners of the earth into your kingdom. Amen.
Most gracious God, may the joy of being Christian be evident in our lives. Let the breaking of bread before us a time of celebration because Jesus has come and because he bids us to follow him. Grant to us a happy and outgoing faith so others cannot help knowing that we are Christians by our love. Be present with us now so that we may be refreshed, renewed, and enabled to witness more effectively to you. Amen.
Mighty God, we thank you for your son that we've so recently celebrated his rise again. But we're so close that we remember that day on the cross, that he shed his blood for us. Father, we thank you for the new covenant that is brought to us as we receive this cup. Amen.
On that night that Jesus was with his friends in that room, he was sitting with them and enjoying a supper, a common meal. And from the table he took a common loaf, and after giving thanks, he broke it and he gave it to them and told them to eat this bread, for it is now his body. In a like way, he took a very common cup from the table, and after giving thanks, he told them to drink from it, for now it was his blood. Let us come to the table to remember the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. Let us come and commune with Christ and with one another. Now, as you go from this place, tend the earth, care for God's creation, and bring forth the fruits of righteousness. Go with the peace of Christ. Amen.